If tonight feels too crowded with thoughts that won't settle, with memories that arrive uninvited, with things you meant to finish but couldn't, maybe this is your quiet place. You don't have to be okay here. You don't have to explain. Just be. Let me hold the story for you for a little while, like a low candle between us in the dark. Tonight's tale is a soft one, painted in shadow, lit with powder and mirrors. A story about beauty worn too long, and silence worn like skin. And if you're still awake, if your heart feels a little heavy, or your eyes a little open, I'd love to know. And if you're still somewhere between waking and sleep, tell me, what kind of night is it where you are? Are you lying in bed, walking a quiet room, or just trying to breathe a little softer? You can leave a quiet trace below, just a word, a moment. I always look for them. Now, let the air settle, let the story begin. There's a mirror, not the kind you know, no silver backing, no smooth glass pane, no edge-free elegance. This one is bronze, beaten and polished by hands long gone. You sit in a clay brick room, humid with incense, its air heavy with the scent of myrrh and tamarisk. The mirror lies flat in your lap, glinting with a dull golden gleam under the shifting candlelight. You lean in, just slightly, and there it is, your face. A little warped, a little older than you remembered, but still you. In ancient Egypt, mirrors didn't just reflect faces. They reflected spirits. They were often shaped like the sun disk, the symbol of life itself, and holding one was almost a divine act. When you looked into that tarnished circle, you weren't just checking your Kohl lines. You were asking the gods to see you, to bless the image staring back. Your fingers tremble slightly as you lift the fine brush carved from reed. At its end, a small bit of black paste glistens like ink. This is Kohl mixed with galena, a mineral rich in lead sulfide. It was supposed to protect your eyes from the glare of the sun, from evil spirits, from sickness. But no one ever warned you that protection could come with a price. You dab it gently under each eye, just like your mother taught you, just like she did, and her mother before her. Galena, when applied daily near the mucous membranes, seeps slowly into the body. The ancient Egyptians didn't know the word toxicity, not in the way we do, but they knew pain. They knew the slow ache of temples, the strange fatigue, the eyes that stopped seeing. Still, they used it, every day, with reverence. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. Behind you, the walls breathe with warmth, thick with ochre and soot. On a small shelf, pots of green pigment wait their turn, malachite ground into a shimmering powder. Another sacred shade, one blessed by Hathor, the goddess of love and joy. It was used to paint the lids of noblewomen, priestesses, even statues of gods. You'd crush the stone, mix it with animal fat or gum arabic, and press it on the skin. And malachite, too, held a secret. In large enough doses, it could scar the liver. Inhaled as dust, it might damage the lungs, but painted carefully, with devotion, it felt like magic. It felt holy. Some scholars say the lead-based makeup may have inadvertently helped stimulate the immune system like a strange, ancient vaccine, but even that theory is debated, whispered in the margins of academic journals. Historians still argue whether the cosmetics were truly sacred tools or soft, slow poisons worn with a smile. Your smile, just now, is faint, reflexive. You've done this routine so often, it's become more ritual than preparation. The act of painting your face is older than the walls around you, older than the dynasty, maybe older than language. To paint is to protect To paint is to become something worthy of being seen. Outside, the Nile flows like a ribbon of liquid dusk, and the ibis cry in the distance. Somewhere, a priest chants to Ra. Somewhere else, a servant girl opens a new pot of ochre and finds it laced with something bitter, something her mistress didn't order. But you just lift the next jar, the one with the deep red paste, made of crushed carmine and possibly trace cinnabar, both beautiful and dangerous. You dab it onto your lips. They part instinctively. It tastes faintly metallic. You never ask why. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. Let's pause here. Gently. You're still in that room. You're still in your body. Even if sleep calls you away, there's something haunting about beauty used as armor, about pigments that promise power and steal life grain by grain. You don't feel sick, not yet, but sometimes, after the festivals, after the long hours in the heat, you find yourself dizzy. Your gums bleed when you laugh too hard. Your skin itches, though you never scratch, and you never stop painting. Because without the paint, you are no one. Without the face, you are nothing. In the court of Egypt, whether you were a queen, a concubine, a priestess, or a perfumer, your value was often measured in color. Color meant favor. Favor meant survival. And survival, well, it was rarely soft. The mirror of polished bronze. The mirror does not lie, but it does not always tell the whole truth, either. You lift it once again, the cool weight of the bronze disc warming slowly in your palm. Its handle, shaped like the stalk of a papyrus plant, rests delicately between your fingers. This mirror has no frame, no gilded edges, no clever tricks of glass. Its surface is slightly pitted, worn by time, by oil, by the repetition of thousands of mornings just like this one. Still, it glints faintly in the dim lamplight, offering you a version of your face softened, rounded, strangely serene. They say the earliest Egyptian mirrors were not for vanity, but for communion. That their perfect roundness was more than aesthetic, it was symbolic. The sun god Ra traveled across the sky in a blazing golden arc each day, and the circle of polished metal you now hold was a way to invite his presence indoors, a small sun in the palm of your hand. When you gaze into it, you do not merely check your reflection, you ask to be seen by something greater. You imagine the queens before you, seated on cushions of dyed linen, robes scented with lotus and cardamom, staring into these same warped gleams. Nefertari, perhaps, applying her Kohl in silence before stepping into a temple, or Tiye, her hair thick with oil and gold dust, adjusting a beaded wig as servants whisper around her. The mirror connected them all, and now it connects you. You lean closer. One side of your mouth droops a little more than the other. A tiredness you didn't earn sleeps just beneath your eyes. There's a small mark near your temple, a burn, maybe, from the time your rouge was too hot, fresh from the sun. You know every inch of this face, yet each morning it surprises you. Like the Nile, your face is never quite the same 2 days in a row. They say malachite helps preserve youth. That lead gives the skin a luminous glow. But the truth behind the pigments is more complex. The cosmetics you wear are alive in their own way. They evolve with you, sometimes gently, sometimes with harm. You reach for the jar beside the mirror, its lid carefully carved with a lotus motif. Inside, the contents shimmer faintly, green, finely powdered malachite, suspended in goose fat. You recall grinding it yourself 2 weeks ago, the sound of stone on stone echoing through the quiet storeroom. Your nose stung for hours afterward. Malachite, while revered, is not kind when inhaled in large amounts. It scratches the throat, clouds the lungs, and can settle into the chest like a secret kept too long. Still, you apply it. A soft line above the lid, a broader stroke below. When finished, your eyes look wider, more commanding. You resemble the statues in the temple courtyard, the ones with serene, watchful faces. You've done it right. But beauty in this age is not only visual, it is political, it is medicinal, it is divine. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The temples employ their own beauticians. Women who study pigments as priests study omens. They know which herbs cool the skin, which oils call down favor, which powders mask disease. There is magic in the mortars they grind, but also danger. A certain flower root can soothe a rash or stop the heart if boiled too long. A mineral might prevent infection or build slowly in the blood until the tongue swells and the limbs forget how to move. Historians still argue whether the ancients knew what their paints truly did. Did they understand that the galena in their Kohl slowly poisoned the blood? Or did they only see its protection, its ability to deflect the evil eye, to reduce infections brought on by the desert wind? Perhaps it was both. Or perhaps the line between faith and science was never so clear. You pause, letting the brush rest on the edge of the jar. Outside, the market stirs. You hear the bleating of a goat, the low murmur of traders unrolling their goods, papyrus scrolls, alabaster jars, maybe another mirror less polished, more humble, but still a son to someone. There's a comfort in repetition. This morning ritual is your anchor in a world of shifting sands and sudden storms. You apply the rouge now, not too much, just enough to suggest warmth. The pigment is mixed with animal tallow and a hint of crushed carmine beetle. It smells faintly sweet, like crushed earth and old fruit, a smell you've grown used to, even fond of. Yet beneath the scent, a memory lingers. The time a maid's skin blistered after using a spoiled batch. The time a boy dropped a pigment jar and was scolded for hours, then found dead by morning. They said he must have tasted it out of curiosity. Or perhaps it was simply bad air. No one knew. No one questioned. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You blink and your gaze returns to the mirror. You look beautiful. But beauty here is heavy. It carries the weight of centuries, of expectations, of gods watching from carved lintels and painted ceilings. Your eyeliner is perfect. Your lips delicately tinted. Slightly parted are the kind poets might write hymns to. And yet your hands tremble as you close the last jar. Outside, the sun begins its climb. Light creeps along the walls of your chamber, casting long shadows. You blow gently on the mirror's surface, then tuck it into a linen wrap, stored carefully beside the rest of your daily tools. It will sleep until nightfall, when you remove your paints with warm water, oil, and ash. A second ritual, a quiet undoing. But the pigments never leave entirely. Not really. They stain the skin, the cloth, the air. You can feel them under your fingernails, in your hair, in the soft spots behind your ears. They are a part of you, now of your blood, perhaps. The poison is patient, and still, you will paint again tomorrow. Eyes that ward off evil. You sit with your spine straight, knees tucked beneath you, the woven reed mat pressing faint lines into your skin. A breeze from the open archway brings with it the scent of desert wind and dried papyrus. But the room remains heavy thick with stillness and expectation. In your hand is the small applicator stick, carved bone smoothed by decades of use. Its tip is dark with kohl, freshly mixed. You raise it to your eye with the steadiness of someone who has done this every day since girlhood. The first line is always the same. You draw it from the inner corner outward, a gesture meant not only to beautify but to protect. This is not makeup in the way modern minds understand it. It is protection. It is prayer. It is a shield drawn in pigment and powder. The ancient Egyptians believed the eye was more than a vessel for vision. It was a symbol of power, of health, of divine sight. The eye of Horus, painted on tomb walls and temple columns, was both talisman and warning, watching, judging, defending. To line your eyes in Kohl was to mimic that divine gaze. You weren't just decorating your face. You were invoking something greater, asking the universe to see you as worthy of protection. But there's a deeper layer still. The Kohl you apply is not merely soot or ash. It is made from galena lead sulfide, ground fine and mixed with animal fat, then aged in sealed pots until it takes on a texture like ink. You know the smell well, earthy, metallic, slightly bitter. The color is deep black, absorbing light. It makes your eyes look wider, your stare more deliberate. You feel safer when you wear it. Everyone does. And yet, that very compound that gives your gaze its power slowly works its way inward. It enters through the skin, through the tear ducts, through the soft corners of the eye. It passes silently into the bloodstream. It does not kill all at once. It is patient. It weaves itself into the rhythms of the body, softening memory, dulling appetite, sometimes thickening the blood until breath comes slower, shallower. You pause a moment, letting the stick rest across your lap. You've felt the headaches. You've had the nosebleeds. But you do not stop. Not when your neighbor's wife went blind in one eye. Not when the maid collapsed after mixing a new batch without gloves. You told yourself they were careless. You told yourself you were not. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You return to the ritual. The second eye, a mirror at your side, reflecting your face in its softened light. You draw the line slower this time, the tip catching slightly on the edge of a healing scratch. You blink, once, then again. The eye waters a little, but the line holds. You look beautiful. You look safe. There is irony in that. Historians still argue whether the toxicity of these substances was understood by those who used them. Some scholars suggest that the Egyptians believed the minor sicknesses caused by galena were acceptable prices for its benefits: spiritual protection, relief from eye infections, status. Others believe the danger was simply unknown, lost beneath layers of cultural reverence and daily habit. Still others argue that the line between medicine and poison was intentionally blurred, that even if the sickness was noticed, it was woven into the mystery of divine offerings, interpreted as a necessary toll to walk beneath the god's gaze. You pick up a damp cloth and gently wipe the edge of your lips, not to remove anything, just to blot. It's a habit now, a gesture. You no longer ask why you do it. There's a sound from outside, footsteps in the corridor, the soft shuffle of sandals on limestone. Perhaps your sister, returning from the well. Perhaps a servant, bringing word. You don't turn to look. You remain by the mirror, finishing the final touch, a tiny dot just at the outer corner of each eye, said to confuse malevolent spirits. A dot of illusion, a mark of misdirection. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You remember a story told to you when you were young, a girl, perhaps no older than you were then, who forgot her morning Kohl. She left the house barefaced, walking toward the temple. On the way, she met a man. He was handsome, kind, too kind. By evening, she was gone, vanished into the reeds near the river. Her mother wept for 7 days. They said the girl had been taken by a spirit, one that mistook her for someone without divine protection, a soul too easy to steal. Of course, now you know that story was more than superstition. But even now, you don't risk going out without your eyes lined. Not ever. In this city crowded and sun-drenched and pulsing with the breath of gods and merchants alike, appearances are more than vanity. They are a kind of language. The woman with heavy black lines is either a priestess or a wife of someone important. The girl with green shadow is in mourning. The man with nothing at all, a worker, or sick, or punished. Cosmetics do not just decorate the body, they define its place. You shift slightly, the mat beneath you creaking. The coal begins to dry, cooling your skin. There is a tingling, a slight pulling sensation. It will pass. You breathe deeply, your hand still resting lightly on the jar. They say Cleopatra herself wrote recipes for cosmetics, that she documented mixtures for balm and rouge and salves made from pearl dust and honey. Some of her formulas included crushed beetles, others galbanum resin. The knowledge was sacred, but it was also dangerous. In the wrong hands, a beauty potion became a poison. An offering became a weapon. You wonder, sometimes, whether Cleopatra ever paused like this, eyes darkened, breath shallow, wondering how much of what she applied would protect her, and how much might one day kill her. But you are not a queen. You are a woman in the quiet of her room, drawing sacred lines on her face to keep the world from creeping too close. You paint not for glory, not for seduction, not even for status. You paint because it is the only kind of safety the world has offered you. And though you cannot name every mineral in the jar, or trace the lineage of each oil and paste, you know their purpose, and you know their cost. You blow gently on your fingers, drying the tips. You close the coal jar, wrap it in linen, and place it back on the shelf. You extinguish the flame beside the mirror. In the dimness, your eyes still shine. They always shine. The jar you hold is older than you. Its glaze is cracked in places, the rim slightly chipped, and a faint ring of pigment stains the lower half, where it once overflowed in a careless moment. But the contents still shimmer. Even now, as you tilt it beneath the lamplight, the green dust inside catches every glimmer like crushed emeralds. This is malachite sacred, glittering, powdered down to the consistency of ash. And in this form, it is both beautiful and silent. It does not cry out when it enters the lungs. It does not scream when it touches raw skin. It offers only color verdant, deep, divine. The shade of sacred things, the shade of rebirth. You dip your smallest finger into the jar. The gesture so practiced, it feels more like memory than movement. The powder clings easily. It is finer than flour, lighter than salt. A breath of wind might scatter it like incense smoke. You lean forward, brushing it gently along the curve of your eyelid, once on the left, once on the right. You do not blink. You do not need to. This, too, is protection. The Egyptians believed malachite held healing power. Its color resembled fertile earth, like the banks of the Nile after the flood. It was associated with Hathor, the goddess of beauty, music, love, and motherhood, an embodiment of joy and wildness wrapped in devotion. Malachite was applied to ward off infection, to draw away darkness, to heal as it adorned. But beauty, as always, walks a fragile path. Powdered malachite contains copper carbonate, and in small amounts it might indeed possess antibacterial properties. But ground too fine, or used too frequently, it becomes a subtle threat. Inhaled over time, it irritates the throat, damages the lungs, leaves behind a trace that never quite fades. The more you use, the more it uses you in return. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The temples kept malachite in abundance, stored in alabaster jars and stone vessels sealed with wax. It was reserved for rituals, for mummification rites, for adorning the statues of gods and the faces of those preparing to meet them. Even in death, beauty was required. You recall the burial of a priestess, months ago. The procession wound its way past the market, past the gates, past the canal. Her face had been painted before she was wrapped in linen eyes rimmed in black, eyelids tinted green, cheeks brushed faintly red. She looked asleep, peaceful. But beneath the peace was something else, something the living refused to name. You had watched her from afar, standing near the wall, your own face still half painted. You'd wondered whether she had chosen her pigments that morning, whether she had known, whether she had suffered. Historians still argue whether the ancient Egyptian use of malachite was grounded in spiritual belief or empirical observation. Some suggest that it reduced eye infections caused by sun glare and dust storms, common afflictions in the desert. Others say its appeal was purely aesthetic or symbolic. But the question lingers, did they know the danger? Or did the danger not matter? You trace your fingers along the rim of the jar. The powder has sunk slightly since you last used it. You'll need to grind more soon. The thought makes your jaw tighten. Grinding malachite is not simple. The stone must be sourced from distant mines sometimes, as far as the eastern deserts or the Sinai. Once delivered, it must be washed, dried, and crushed with mortar and pestle until its grain vanishes. The dust must be sifted, mixed with oil or animal fat, tested on scraps of skin to ensure the right consistency. You remember the last batch. You had coughed for 3 days afterward, but the color, it was perfect. You had worn it for the festival of Wepet Renpet, and even the high priestess had asked which artisan had painted your face. It had been you, and it had hurt. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. There is a moment, every time you apply this pigment, when you wonder what it's doing inside you, not just on the surface, but beneath the lashes, beneath the skin, down through the blood and the breath. You do not feel sick, but sometimes your eyes water in the heat. Sometimes your voice is hoarse, even when you haven't spoken. You tell no one, because beauty is its own language in this world. It is currency. It is armor. It is legacy. You wear it like a cloak, a silent agreement between you and the gods. You lift the jar one last time, shaking the remnants into your palm. You smear it across your fingertips, watching the glitter sink into the lines of your skin. It reminds you of the patterns in the Nile silt veins of life, buried just below the surface. There is something holy in this dust, but also something hungry. You close the jar, wrap it in linen, place it among the others in your chest of powders and oils. You will use it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Because this is not just decoration. This is not indulgence. It is ritual. It is medicine. It is belief made visible. And maybe, just maybe, that belief is stronger than the poison. The jar is round and narrow-necked, made of translucent alabaster, with soft swirls of white and gold that catch the light like moving smoke. Its contents shift thickly when you tilt it amber-hued oil, infused with petals, resin, and thyme. You remove the lid, a small disc of polished wood sealed with wax and linen string, and immediately the scent spills into the room, warm, deep, and strangely alive. This is not the perfume of pleasure, not entirely. It is the oil of preservation, of ritual, of intimacy. It is perfume, yes, but also medicine. It is worship. It is disguise. You dip the tip of your finger into the jar and lift a small droplet, letting it catch the light before touching it to your neck. First the left side, then the right, then beneath the jaw, behind the ears, the wrists, the space beneath your collarbone. These are the known points, the soft places where scent lingers. But you pause a moment longer and dab once, gently, beneath your nose, just enough to smell it as you breathe. The oil is made from desert myrrh and wild juniper, with traces of crushed lotus petals and aged palm resin. It was pressed from rare seeds grown along the Nile's edge, far from the safety of cities. Each vial is precious, each drop the result of harvest, labor, and risk. And if used too frequently or left too long in heat, the mixture can sour, ferment, even poison. Some women, desperate to preserve youth, rubbed it into their faces twice a day until the skin blistered, flaked, bled. Some claimed the pain meant it was working. Others swore they heard whispers in the oil at night, as if the desert wind had followed it in. But still, they applied it. Still, they worshipped its glow. You are more careful. You use only what you need. And even that is dangerous. Historians still argue whether ancient perfumes and oils were primarily used for health or seduction. The lines blur. Documentation from temple walls and burial papyri suggest both. Some believe the fragrance was intended to guide the soul through the afterlife, to make the body irresistible, not only to the living, but to the gods. Others argue the scent simply masked the stench of sweat and sickness in a land where heat never sleeps. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The body is sacred in Egypt. It must be kept whole, perfumed, intact, even in death. The dead are washed in oil, anointed with sacred balm, and wrapped in linen soaked in scent. The living prepare themselves the same way each morning, a rehearsal for eternity. You pick up the small spoon resting beside the jar, a thin slice of ivory curved like a flower petal, and scoop another few drops. This time, you rub the oil into your hands, then trace them down your arms, across your shoulders. The motion is deliberate. There is no rush. To rush is to offend. To treat the oil like water is to insult the desert. And the desert is never kind when insulted. You remember a girl, Tia, who once poured half a jar onto her hair before a festival. She had stolen it, they said, from a merchant's caravan, mistaking its sweetness for something safe. That night, her skin turned red. The next morning, she could not rise. Her breath was thin, her tongue dry. She did not speak again. They buried her with the empty jar. You were there. You saw the way the mourners avoided her body, the way no one mentioned her name during the prayers, as if perfume, when misused, could curse a soul. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You finish applying the oil. Your skin glows. It gleams faintly in the morning light filtering through the open shutters, golden against the terracotta walls. The fragrance clings, low and warm, like honey left in the sun. There is a reason Cleopatra bathed in oils, not just for beauty, not for allure alone, but for preservation. Her skin, they say, never cracked. Her scent preceded her by hours. The oils she wore were so potent, they lingered in rooms long after she left. Some believe she made her own blends mixing cassia bark, mint, iris root, and rare Arabian balsams. Others say she had slaves for that, perfumers who bled their fingers on thorns, collecting the petals she required. You will never have her power, but you share her habits. And the dangers are the same. The oils coat the lungs. They blur the breath. When worn too often, they can stir the blood, raise fevers, wake strange dreams. There are scrolls in the temple archives, fragile and worm-eaten, that speak of women who drank perfume in moments of grief. Some died, some simply disappeared. The smell of their chambers never faded. You close the jar carefully, pressing the lid back into place, tying the string once more. You store it among the others: lavender oil, cedar resin, blue lotus tincture, all precious, all potentially fatal. The desert gives its gifts slowly, and it takes them back without warning. You move to the window, letting the sunlight brush against your face. The oil warms beneath it, releasing a second wave of scent, sharper now, more intimate. It smells like longing, like memory. And you remember a different kind of pain. Your mother's voice, stern but quiet. Always use the oil, even if you have nothing else. Even if your robes are torn, your jewelry gone. If you smell like the gods, you'll be treated like one. And so you did. Even when your fingers blistered from carrying the jars too long in the sun. Even when your scalp burned from too much salve. Even when you could barely stand from dizziness, you still dabbed the oil behind your ears. Because without it, you were bare, vulnerable, mortal. The gods smell no weakness, and neither do men. You turn from the window. The room feels smaller now, not claustrophobic, just close, like a jar being sealed. You sit again at the low table. The mirror waits. So do the powders, the brushes, the pigments. You will paint yourself again today. You will line your eyes. You will tint your lips. You will anoint your skin. And every drop, every stroke, will whisper a small danger into your blood. But it is a danger, you know, and that makes it bearable. The small box that holds your lip pigment is carved from dark wood, smoothed with use and age. Its lid fits snugly, etched with a faint design, two stylized lotuses bowing toward one another, their petals touching in a gesture more like silence than bloom. You open it slowly, not because the box resists, but because the contents command a kind of reverence. Inside, the paste gleams under the morning light. It is a rich, reddish brown, darker than ochre, warmer than rust. It smells faintly of beeswax and dried figs. But there is something else beneath it, something metallic, something that sits low in the throat if you breathe too deeply. You pick up the applicator, a thin reed shaved to a point, and stir the mixture. The consistency is soft, almost velvety, like fruit left too long in the sun. You press it to your lower lip first, letting the color bloom outward like a slow fire. Then the upper lip. You rub them together lightly. No mirror needed for this part. You've done it enough times. This pigment is a blend of red ochre and crushed carmine, sometimes drawn from the bodies of dried beetles, sometimes from clay baked under the desert sun. But yours is different. Yours has a trace of cinnabar in it. That's why it shines. That's why it tastes faintly of iron. And that's why it is dangerous. Cinnabar, the bright red mineral form of mercury sulfide, has always been seductive. Its color is unmatched, vivid, powerful, deeply associated with vitality and transformation. The Egyptians believed it could strengthen the body, awaken the senses, preserve the soul. It was used in amulets, in funerary paint, and on rare, expensive occasions in cosmetics. But mercury is a liar. It does not strengthen. It does not heal. It sinks into the skin, into the gums, into the breath. It eats quietly, without force or sound, stripping clarity from the mind, quickness from the limbs. It leaves you glowing, even as it hollows you out. Historians still argue whether cinnabar was truly used in lip color or merely ceremonial face paint. The texts are unclear. Some scrolls describe its application in the preparation of beauty for the Feast of Rebirth. Others warn cryptically of a red kiss that curses. But in your house, the warning was always simple: use a little. Only a little. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You press your lips once more, then blot them with a scrap of soft linen. The cloth stains rust red. A familiar shape, like a petal or a wound. You fold it and place it back in the box. It will be used again. There is power in the color red. In ancient Egypt, it was the color of both danger and desire. The god Set, lord of chaos, was often associated with red things, red stones, red storms, red hair. But so was the goddess Isis when she grieved, when she bled, when she called life back from the mouth of death. To wear red on the mouth is to invite attention, but not always the kind you want. You think of the temple girls who paint their lips before a procession. They walk in silence, veils covering all but the mouth. Their movements are choreographed, their smiles practiced. You've seen their feet wobble, sometimes lightheaded from the heat, or maybe from what they've swallowed. Some use lip color mixed with powdered mandrake root, claiming it awakens charm, even visions. But mandrake is poison. Everyone knows that. Still, the priestesses smile, always smile. You lean back slightly, letting the oil on your skin and the pigment on your lips settle together, blending into a soft sheen. The room is quiet. The only sound is the fluttering of linen at the window, pulled by a wind carrying dust and heat, and the distant thrum of life. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. Your tongue touches your lip instinctively. The taste is faint, metallic, floral at the edges. It reminds you of your first kiss, awkward, quick, behind the clay wall of the bread oven. The boy had laughed. You hadn't. You'd felt dizzy afterward, and not from his touch. The pigment had been fresh. Too much cinnabar. You had tasted it for hours. You never told anyone, because the act of beauty here is not only about how you look. It is about what you conceal, what you endure, what you carry without letting it show. You think of the older women in the city, the ones with lined faces and eyes that still gleam like obsidian. Their hands tremble now. Some wear gloves not for fashion, but to hide the swelling in their fingers. Some paint their lips with such precision it feels like defiance, as if to say, yes, this hurts, and still I choose it. The pigment you wear is a kind of promise, a silent vow to remain visible, to remain desirable, to remain powerful, even if it burns, even if it bruises the inside of your mouth, even if your breath sometimes comes short and your dreams are strange. You rise slowly and walk across the room to the standing basin. Its water is still, faintly scented with lotus petals that have long since gone pale. You dip your fingers in, press them to your lips, then let the water trickle down your chin. The pigment smears slightly, but most of it remains. It always does. The red sinks in deeper than the skin. It knows where to hide. You dry your face with a cloth and return to your seat. The box sits open. The pigment glows softly in the half light. You close it, carefully, not tightly, not forever, because you will need it again. Because the world does not care how soft your voice is, how still your hands are, how gently you move through it. It sees the red. It answers the red. It fears it. It wants it. And so you wear it. She arrives before the dawn, when the sky is still bruised with night, and the stars have not yet resigned their watch. You hear the soft hush of her feet first, sliding across the stone floor like whispers wrapped in cloth. The priestess does not knock. She never has. She steps into the room as though she were a part of it, just another shadow waiting for the morning to catch her outline. She carries a basket, tightly woven, closed with a strip of red-dyed leather. You do not ask what's inside. You never have. She sets it down near the brazier and kneels beside it, her spine as straight as a papyrus reed, her veil slipping slightly to reveal a sliver of cheek already painted with the faint green gleam of malachite. Her presence shifts the room. The air thickens. Not unpleasantly, but deliberately, like a curtain being drawn across a window to keep the light from entering too quickly. You watch her fingers, always her fingers. They are narrow, knotted at the knuckles, stained at the tips with years of pigment, oil, and things unnamed. She wears no rings, no bangles, no marks of beauty except what her craft provides. She is a vessel of transformation, and she smells of fennel, crushed lavender, and something deeper, something like bitter almonds or stone dust. A scent that speaks of long-kept secrets. She does not smile. She never does. The priestess begins by removing the lid of her basket. Inside are small pots, some ceramic, some copper, a few carved from alabaster. Each is carefully sealed. She places them on the floor in a precise order, a triangle pointing inward. It is not art. It is ritual. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You do not speak. She does not like words in this part of the process. She unrolls a strip of dyed linen beside you, folds it once, then lays out her tools. Brushes made from marten fur, mixing stones blackened from years of pigment, a small fan of palm leaves tied with twine, and the blade thin, obsidian, sharp enough to slice air. She does not always use the blade, but she brings it, always. She begins with your cheeks, not powder paste. It smells sweet, like dried plums, but when it touches your skin, it tingles. Not cold, not hot, just aware. It pulls at the pores, tightens the flesh. You sit very still. This is no ordinary cosmetic. It's not something you apply yourself with a mirror and a quick breath. What she uses is meant for ceremony, for preparation, for things that happen after the palace doors close and the braziers burn down low. She leans close to your face. You feel her breath, faint and dry, like sun-warmed papyrus. Her fingers move without hesitation. Each stroke, each dab, each smudge is intentional. She knows your face better than you do. She knows which side you sleep on. She knows where your skin cracks when you laugh. She knows how your mouth pulls slightly more on one side, and she paints accordingly. Historians still argue whether priestesses acted only as religious functionaries, or whether they also served as keepers of beauty, medicine, and memory. The lines blur here, too, in certain temples, especially those devoted to Hathor or Isis. The boundary between sacred ritual and cosmetic preparation dissolved entirely. To be painted by a priestess was not vanity, it was communion. You feel it now. The soft rhythm of her hand against your brow, the way she murmurs beneath her breath, not words, but syllables, tones, frequencies meant to please the gods or silence the restless things inside you. She mixes something in a small dish, crushed blue lotus, soaked in wine. She applies it with a flat-edged brush to the hollows beneath your eyes. You blink once, and the world softens. The priestess knows more than she says. She knows that the pigments can harm. She knows that lead dulls the blood, that cinnabar bites the gums. She knows that the red paste she's dabbing on your chin has caused women to faint, to weep, to bleed from places no pigment should reach. But she does not warn you, because it is not her place. It is not her secret to tell. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. She moves to your arms now, brushing a salve along your shoulders and the curve of your neck. It smells of frankincense and bitter herbs, with a trace of vinegar, a poultice of sorts, meant to protect you from something unseen, or perhaps to conceal something already there. You wonder, as you always do, where she learned these things. Not from scrolls, not from temple lectures. She is older than any scribe, older than any servant in your house. Her voice, when she chooses to use it, carries the grain of old wood and well water. Her words are few, but when she speaks them, even the house goes quiet. She told you once, not long ago, but not recently either, that there were women before her who painted faces in the same way, that their tools were passed down like relics, that the knowledge came from dreams, not books, and that some things could not be taught. You believed her, because you have seen what she can do. You have seen her calm a girl shaking with fever by placing a drop of oil on her tongue. You have seen her draw a line of pigment across a widow's cheek and bring color back to her voice. You have seen her silence a rival's anger with a single touch of balm to the temples. She is not a magician, but she is not just a servant. She is something else. You open your eyes again. She is still painting, still whispering, still mixing. You wonder if she ever paints herself. You have never seen her without the veil, never seen her bare hands. You do not know what she looks like beneath the layers of linen and pigment and time. Perhaps no one does. Perhaps she paints herself in private, using colors you've never seen. Perhaps that's the final secret. She finishes at last. The final touch, a line of powdered lapis above each brow. Blue, bold, blessed. She presses her palms to yours, her skin dry and cool. Her eyes meet yours through the veil. For the first time, she speaks. "You are seen," she says. Then she gathers her tools. She packs them slowly, methodically, sealing each jar, wrapping each brush in cloth. The blade is the last to go, slipped into a pocket in the basket's side. She does not bow, she does not wait. She leaves the way she came in silence, in shadow, in absolute certainty that her work will last until the next ceremony, the next feast, the next moment when the gods must be pleased. You sit alone again, but not undone. You rise, face tingling faintly from the paints, the oils, the unknowns. You catch your reflection in the polished bronze. You do not look like yourself. You look like someone older, someone distant, someone the gods might remember. And somewhere, at the back of your mind, you wonder, how much of that was beauty, and how much of it was poison? You remember the first time the court sent for you. It had rained the day before, a rare storm that turned the sand outside the city to thick ochre paste. The streets were quiet that morning, muffled under layers of wet dust and drying reed mats. You had risen early, as always, thinking it would be just another day spent grinding pigment, re-waxing wicks, heating oil until the resin dissolved smooth and clear. But then a servant arrived. He did not bow, did not speak beyond the essential words. "The Pharaoh's steward requests your presence. Bring your red." Your red? Not your name, not your trade, just the color. The one you had mixed a month ago from 3 rare ingredients and left to age in a carved ebony jar sealed with fig gum and a line of prayer. The color that turned dry lips into silk and made even the oldest eyes linger. A hue too dark to be called rose, too warm to be called rust. It was not for everyday wear. It was for worship or war. You packed your kit in silence. You did not ask what the Pharaoh wanted. You did not need to. You were summoned to the women's quarter of the palace, through a garden of wild thyme and climbing jasmine, past a wall lined with painted falcons and sun discs. Inside, the chamber was dim but not cold, fragrant with cinnamon. soft with worn linen, alive with tension. There were no words of welcome, only waiting. And at the center of the room, seated on a low dais carved with hieroglyphs of triumph and fertility, was her, not the pharaoh, but his favored queen. She did not smile, she did not move, but she watched you with the stillness of someone who understood that beauty was both shield and weapon, and that you were holding both in your hands. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You approached slowly, not out of fear, but out of understanding. To apply paint to a queen's lips is to touch history with your own hands, and she was known for her silence, known for her stillness. They said her beauty had stopped battles, that a visiting prince once forgot his treaty entirely after she entered the room, wearing that same shade on her mouth. The attendant stepped aside. You knelt before her. Her skin was flawless, not in the way of youth, but in the way of devotion. Oiled, scrubbed, perfumed daily, her Kohl was perfect, her cheeks already touched with a hint of rose, but her lips were bare, and they were waiting. You unsealed the jar. The scent that escaped was like nothing else, myrrh and ash, and something sharp, something that pricked the air like memory. You stirred the pigment gently, ensuring the blend had not separated. It shimmered, slow and dark like blood underwater. The queen did not blink. You dipped the brush, and then, with a hand steadier than you'd ever known yourself to possess, you painted. First the lower lip, one stroke, then another, building color like a sunrise. Then the upper, curved gently into the corners. She did not flinch. Her breath did not shift. But when you stepped back, you saw something change in her. Her face had not softened, but it had become whole. That color your red was not just pigment. It was authority. It was hunger cloaked in elegance. It was the shade of command. Historians still argue whether royal pigments were made differently than common ones. Some suggest they were mixed with rare oils or crushed stones, reserved only for the throne. Others argue that it wasn't the ingredients that made them powerful, but the way they were worn, what they meant in a room where silence could kill, and a glance could change the fate of kingdoms. You didn't know then what your color would become. You didn't know the pharaoh would ask for it the next day. Not for his queen, but for himself. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. He entered without warning. The room was cleared before his steps had even fully echoed. You had dropped into a bow, hands trembling despite the practiced stillness in your face. You had never expected to meet him, certainly not alone. He asked to see the jar. He held it in his hand like a sacred object. He asked you what was in it, not like a ruler demanding a list, but like a child asking how a flame works. You told him the truth: red ochre, fig oil, crushed hibiscus, a trace of lead oxide for brilliance. You did not mention the warning that came with the oxide. He did not ask for it. He asked you to paint it on him. His face? You hesitated. Of course you did. But you obeyed because you knew what obedience meant, because you knew what happened to women who said no. And so, you dipped the brush. You painted the color across his mouth, along his jawline, even across his brows, just enough to give the impression of something otherworldly. And when you were done, he did not smile, but he said, "Now I look like someone worth remembering." He wore it that evening in the Hall of Mirrors, and the next day, messengers were sent across the city. Artists were ordered to replicate the shade. Apothecaries were asked to mimic the blend. Priests chanted it into the record books. The red of the horizon, they called it, the pharaoh's shade. And only you knew where it had truly begun. In your hands, from your bowl, from pigments mixed in a room lit by only one candle and a thread of worry. You were not named, But your color was, you see it now on women in the market, on dancers at festivals, on brides during their blessing rites. It has become more than a trend. It has become legend. And legend rarely asks where truth begins. You still have the original jar. You keep it sealed, now wrapped in linen, placed in the farthest corner of your box. You do not wear it. Not anymore, because sometimes the things we create in quiet become too loud to carry. Because sometimes what looks like power leaves behind something else in the body, something slow, something heavy, something that tastes like metal when you forget to breathe. You apply other shades now, softer ones, but still, on nights when the wind is right, when the moon is low, when the city sleeps uneasily, you open that box, you lift the lid, you stare into the red, and you remember that your hands once painted a queen, and then a king, and then a kingdom, all with a pigment that sings and stings in equal measure. There's a sweetness to it. At first, a soft, metallic tang that clings to the back of your tongue and fades before it ever quite becomes unpleasant. It lingers in your breath, not sharp like vinegar or bitter like spoiled wine, but soft like old fruit, like dusty grapes pressed under weight, left too long in their own silence. This is the taste of your powders, not the scent, not the touch, the taste. And you know it intimately, because no matter how carefully you wash your hands, no matter how many times you rinse your brushes or wipe your mouth with clean linen, the powder finds its way in. It coats the cups you drink from. It settles into the creases of your lips. It mixes with your breath, your sweat, your silence. You've never meant to swallow it, and yet, over time, you have. Everyone does. You remember the first time you noticed it. You were 19, perhaps, sitting in the corner of a busy courtyard during the season of flood. The Nile had swelled and stilled, the city brimming with fruit and noise, the markets bloated with figs, garlic, silver. You had been laughing, half drunk on palm wine, your face still warm from the heat of the day and the ceremony before it. Someone handed you a wedge of bread. You bit into it, and suddenly, there it was, sweetness. Not the sugar of dates or honey, but a flavor that didn't belong. Subtle, odd, familiar. You pressed your tongue to the roof of your mouth. It wasn't new. It had been there before. You simply hadn't noticed. The lead in your pigments, primarily galena and cerussite, was never meant to be consumed, but it was everywhere, mixed with fat and vinegar, with ash and fig oil. It was applied around the eyes, the cheeks, the mouth, sometimes even dusted on the skin to brighten the face, to reflect the sunlight, to mask exhaustion. Lead had power. It brightened, it softened, it cured, or so they thought. And it killed slowly. Historians still argue whether lead-based cosmetics contributed to widespread illness among the elite classes in ancient Egypt. Some argue the doses were too small to do harm. Others point to writings, vague but insistent, that speak of tremors, memory loss, and unexplainable deaths. Cases where a woman suddenly forgot the names of her children, or a scribe's hand began to shake without injury. There are theories buried in the archives of Alexandria, barely translated. But the body remembers what the pen forgets. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You feel it sometimes now, when you are alone in the evening, scrubbing your face by the light of one dim oil lamp. Your tongue tastes faintly of dust. Your gums ache. Your breath catches just a little at the top of each inhale. It passes, always. You never speak of it. The girl who once trained beside you, her name was Cetra. She used to dip her brush directly into the pigment jar and tap the excess on her palm. She said it saved time. Her lips were always stained even when she hadn't painted them. She was quick, clever, beautiful. She died at 24. Fever, they said. But you remember her voice the week before slurred. You remember how her hands trembled when she tried to tighten her hair wrap. You remember the way she blinked too slowly, as if her body had become heavy in places she couldn't name. You remember? But you said nothing then, and you say nothing now. Because to speak would be to name it, and to name it would be to stop. And stopping is not something you do. There are powders to mix, clients to paint, faces to restore. And always, always there is the red. You still wear it, though not the pharaoh's shade. Something milder now, mixed with ochre and beeswax, free of oxide. Or so you think. You're never quite sure. You don't make your own anymore. The ingredients are expensive. The time is short. You buy from vendors. You trust what they say, because you must. You touch your lips with your fingers. Dry, always dry. You lick them. The taste returns. Like honey. Like iron. Like memory. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. There are women you know older now. Those who painted their faces with devotion every day of their youth, who speak softly when they speak at all. Their words drift like ash. Their steps are uneven. They wear gloves not from modesty, but because their fingers have stiffened into strange shapes. Some can no longer grip a brush. Some sleep for hours during the day, their limbs unresponsive. They are not ill, they insist, just tired, just older. But you see it, you feel it, and still you paint because there is power in appearance, in control, in ritual. And because the alternative is far more terrifying to step outside barefaced, vulnerable, plain, to allow the world to see you without your armor, your sacred lines, your silence made visible. You remember your mother's last days. She painted herself until the end, even when her hands shook, even when her lips cracked and her eyes watered without cause. She would sit by the mirror, her bones showing through her skin, and mix her pigments with care. You offered to help. She refused. She said the paint made her feel alive, even as it stole her. When she died, her lips were still red. They buried her with the brush. You took the rest. Not to keep, not to honor, to survive. You repurposed her jars, scraped them clean, made new mixtures, sold what you could, wore what you must. And in her color soft, rose stone red, you learned to find your own voice. Your tongue is tingling now. You rise, slowly, walk to the basin, and drink from the clay cup beside it. The water is cool, slightly bitter. You wonder if the cup is clean, if the rim holds pigment from your lips, if every swallow carries another memory into your body. You don't care. You rinse your mouth. You do not spit, because it is already inside you, because it has been for years, because you have tasted lead and made it feel like honey. They gather before the sunrise, veiled in linen so fine it could catch on a whisper. Their feet are bare, yet they move across the temple stone with the weightless certainty of dancers who've learned to make silence part of their skin. You sit near the edge of the antechamber, eyes lowered, pretending to tend your brush case, but you watch them. You always do. They are the daughters of Hathor, priestesses devoted to the goddess of love, joy, music, and beauty. But nothing about their presence feels indulgent or light-hearted. These are not women given to laughter. They are instruments, vessels, taught to sing when asked, to sway when summoned, to adorn their bodies in such perfect balance that even the gods take notice. And what adorns them first is paint. One kneels beside the wall, dipping a finger into a shallow dish of rose-colored balm, rubbing it slowly into the hollows beneath her cheeks. Another traces a line of gold dust paste across her brow, the gleam catching faint candlelight as though the sun had arrived early. A third sits with her eyes closed, while a servant applies Kohl so dark it seems to steal the light from the room. You know their materials well. You've made them. You've sold to them. You've stood in shadow while they debated between two shades of blue for the feast of drunkenness. And you've watched them age. Not fast, not openly, but beneath the perfection, beneath the rose and the gold, and the obsidian black, you have seen the trembling hands, the yellowing eyes, the way one girl winced when you helped her adjust her veil, the pressure of touch pressing too hard into the paper-thin skin behind her ear. They are not immune. Their beauty is not protection. It is performance, and performance has a cost. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. They begin their hymn now, voices rising in low unison, barely audible. You close your eyes, not to sleep, but to feel it, the vibration, the power. Hathor's name is not spoken so much as breathed, as if merely shaping the syllables with your lips is an act of devotion. And then the tambourines begin. Small, delicate, bells tied to the wrists of their garments instead of held in hand. They move as one, each step echoing the rhythm of the river, each gesture a prayer. You've watched these rituals 100 times, maybe more, but today you notice something new. One of the dancers, Alma, the youngest, has forgotten to smile, only for a second. But it's enough. Her face, usually serene, flickers with something else. Discomfort, fatigue, regret. You see her glance toward the altar as if it might offer comfort. It does not. Her lips are stained deep berry red. The pigment is too strong, not her usual shade. You know because you mixed it 2 days ago. At her request, she had asked for something bolder, something the goddess would not ignore. You had warned her. She had laughed. You know what's in that shade-crushed beetle shell, carob root, and a trace of cinnabar, enough to burn slightly if left on too long, enough to make the breath catch in the throat if swallowed, enough to linger under the tongue even when the mouth has been washed. But it was beautiful, and for the daughters of Hathor, beauty is obedience. Historians still argue over how closely temple dancers followed cosmetic protocols. Some claim they were forbidden from using certain pigments during sacred rites, lest they desecrate their bodies with mortal toxins. Others point to tomb paintings where the priestesses are richly adorned, even in scenes of mourning. But none of the scholars mention the girls themselves, what they knew, what they suspected, what they endured in silence. You open your eyes again. Alma has recovered. Her smile is back. Her steps are in rhythm. The performance continues. But you feel her pain in your own jaw, a dull ache. Familiar? The hymn ends. The priestesses lower their heads in unison. A single candle is extinguished, and the chamber exhales. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You rise, quietly, without drawing attention. You gather your kit and make your way around the edge of the chamber, toward the small side room where pigments are stored. You expect to be alone, but you're not. Another girl is already there, older, more experienced. Her name is Tamari. She's seated on the floor, head bowed, rubbing her temples with both hands. She doesn't look up when you enter. I warned her, she says softly. You don't reply. She wanted to be noticed, she continues. She wanted the goddess to see her. You kneel beside her, open your box, pull out a cloth and a small jar of vinegar mixed with milk and oil, an old remedy meant to cool the skin, reduce the flush caused by strong pigments. You offer it. She takes it wordlessly. She won't stop, Tamari murmurs. None of us will. You know that. You nod, and then, as if the act is holy, you begin to mix a new shade, softer, No cinnabar, no beetle shell, just crushed fig, a touch of honey, a trace of rose clay. Tamari watches your hands. She won't wear it. She'll say it's too pale. You shrug. Then she'll survive a little longer. There's no triumph in your voice, no bitterness, just quiet resolve. You cannot make them stop. You can only offer the option. You leave the jar beside her. You do not wait to see if she takes it. You return to your room before the next hymn begins, before the sun is high enough to show the cracks in the plaster or the deepening lines beside your eyes. You sit by your mirror, and for a moment, just a moment, you do not reach for a brush. You simply breathe. In, out, the scent of resin, the memory of red, the weight of silence, shared among women who worship beauty like it's a language only their bodies understand. And you think again of Hathor, goddess of love, of joy, of pleasure, and of what she must have demanded in return. It begins as a dot, just a small mound of hardened wax the size of a fig seed, placed with reverence at the crown of the head. But in the heat of the temple, under the slow burn of the afternoon sun, that dot becomes something more. It melts. It breathes. It bleeds fragrance. You have worn one yourself, on feast days and weddings and sacred evenings, when the moon rose like a pearl behind the river palms. It begins cool, almost heavy, and the scent is faint at first, sweet, resinous, like myrrh wrapped in honey. But as the wax softens, as the oil warms against your scalp and trickles downward into the roots of your hair, it becomes something else entirely. A perfume so intimate it feels like memory, a presence you cannot see, only feel moving through you, changing you. Today, you prepare one not for yourself, but for a widow young, newly silent, her hands still uncalloused from the life she must now build alone. She sits quietly in the corner of the chamber, her shoulders draped in mourning linen, her hair pulled back in loose twists that once held pins of ivory and lapis. No jewelry now, no color, just loss. But she must attend the procession, and so you mix the cone. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The recipe has changed little over generations. Beeswax is softened over a low flame, stirred gently with oils extracted from lotus and tamarisk, then thickened with powdered myrrh and a few drops of precious kaifi, a sacred blend of herbs, spices, and resins once used to commune with the gods. The perfume is not cheap, but for this widow, it is provided by the temple, an offering, an obligation. The city expects her to appear graceful, fragrant, composed. Her scent must not remind others of death, only of memory, only of longing. As the cone cools and hardens into its final shape, you take a moment to observe her. She has not looked up. Her face remains still. Her mouth is tight. She has not cried, not today, not here, perhaps not yet. You want to tell her that the perfume will help, that it will soothe her grief, hide the smell of sorrow clinging to her skin. But you don't, because it's not entirely true. Historians still argue over the full contents of ancient Egyptian perfume cones. Some suggest they were purely decorative, placed atop wigs for ritual purposes, never meant to melt. Others believe they were practical, slow-release aromatics, intended to mask body odor and attract attention. But what few mention is the way they felt, the way that slow trickle of wax down the scalp mimicked tears, the way the scent filled the nose until you could no longer remember what your skin smelled like without it. You carry the cone across the room and kneel behind the widow. She does not turn. You part her hair gently, set the base of the cone at the crown, and press until it adheres. It is warm now. It will begin melting as soon as she steps outside. It will soften in the sun, you whisper. She nods but says nothing. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You stay for a moment longer, adjusting the folds of her shawl, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. Her skin is warm, dry. She does not move, but you sense her breathing shift a long inhale, a slow exhale, like something has broken just beneath the surface. Not loudly, just enough to be felt. Then she stands. She thanks you not with words, but with a single touch to your wrist, brief and trembling. And she leaves. As she disappears through the temple gate, the scent follows her, not sharp, not overpowering, but soft, ghostly. The cone has begun to melt. You can see it glisten at the edges already, catching the late light. By the time the procession reaches the garden, the oil will have slipped past her ear, into the nape of her neck, onto her shoulder. It will stain the linen slightly. No one will mention it, because grief must be fragrant, and absence must be sweet. You return to your workbench, wiping the last of the wax from your fingers. The scent clings to your nails. You breathe it in. You know it well. You wore the same blend when your sister died, when you walked behind the priestesses, eyes forward, spine locked, when your sandals scraped over crushed petals and your knees shook. Not from sorrow, but from the strange weight of stillness. The perfume had melted so quickly that day. It ran down your temple and into your mouth. It tasted like resin and salt and something old, something from deep in your chest you hadn't named. You hadn't spoken for 3 days after, and when you finally did, your voice still smelled like her. That's the danger of these cones. Not the ingredients, not the temperature, not even the lead. If it's in there, it's the memory they trap. The way the scent becomes inseparable from the moment. How even years later, you can walk past a spice merchant's cart and feel your knees go weak because of a single whiff. Because suddenly, she is there again, smiling, then gone. You mix another cone, smaller this time, for a girl coming of age. The scent is lighter jasmine, fig flower, powdered amber. She requested something sweet, something youthful. You don't tell her how quickly that scent will change once it melts, how the oil will mix with her own skin, how it will mark her, how she will remember this scent for the rest of her life, no matter how short or long it may be. She will remember it as the smell of becoming, and that is its own kind of danger. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You pause your mixing and open a jar tucked away on the far end of your shelf, an old cone you saved from another time. It's hardened now, dusty around the edges. The scent faded, but not gone. You hold it to your nose and inhale. It smells like your mother's lap. It smells like a day you thought would last forever. It smells like the moment the music stopped, and no one knew what to say. You return the cone to its place, reseal the lid, and sit for a moment in the stillness. Perfume, in this land, is not a luxury. It is a language, a spell, a scar that smells like a story. And when it melts, it does not disappear. It seeps in and stays. It begins with exfoliation. That's the word they would use now, clinical, precise, safe-sounding. But in your world, it is simpler. You scrub until your skin tingles, until the layer that touched yesterday is gone, until what remains feels clean, not just to the eye, but to the gods. You dip a coarse cloth into the small clay bowl of natron and water. The crystals are sharp and cool between your fingers, their edges softened only slightly by the liquid. You press the cloth to your shoulder and begin to rub, slowly, in circles, then lines, then harder. The scent of natron rises around you dry, faintly metallic, unmistakably ancient. Natron was the salt of ritual. The desert gave it freely, layering it across dry lake beds and ancient banks, waiting for the devout to scoop it up. Mixed with water, it became a cleanser. Mixed with oil, it became balm. Used dry, it drew out moisture from the dead. But you are still alive. So you scrub, your skin reddens under your hand. Not raw, not yet, but stinging. And this is good. It means the mask is coming away. The dust of yesterday, the lines of yesterday, the poison of yesterday. You do this every morning, not because you are vain, but because you are seen, and when you are seen, you must be polished, like stone, like offering bowls, like truth. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You move to the other arm now, working along the elbow, the shoulder, the soft underside where the skin is pale and reluctant. The natron stings more there. You grit your teeth. Keep going. You think of the girls who do not scrub, the ones who peel instead using sand or stone or paste made from crushed dates and vinegar that leaves their skins so tight they cannot smile without cracking. You tried that once. Once was enough. There are softer methods, ointments, creams, pastes made from crushed almonds and honey, but those are expensive, reserved for brides or high-born women with no tasks that would undo their smoothness before noon. You do not have that luxury. You reach for the water jar and pour a stream over your shoulder, washing away the film of salt and skin. The water runs cloudy. You watch it fall onto the stone floor, sink into the cracks. You imagine it carrying your old self away, drop by drop. Your skin is red now, but clean. You pat it dry with linen, careful not to rub, careful not to undo what you've just endured. Historians still debate whether Egyptian skincare was primarily religious or cosmetic. They point to burial texts that describe the washing of the dead with natron, the anointing of the corpse with sacred oil, the rubbing of gums with resin to preserve the mouth for speech in the afterlife. But they often ignore the living, that the same rituals were applied day after day, not only to honor the divine, but to guard against decay in the here and now. And yet, even among the living, the line between cleanliness and pain is thin. You examine your forearms. Tiny cuts bloom at the crease of your elbow. You hadn't noticed when you scrubbed. You press a wet cloth to them. They do not stop bleeding right away. You think of a friend, Marisa, who once scrubbed so hard that the skin on her knuckles peeled back like bark. She wrapped them in linen, hid them beneath her cuffs, and painted her lips as though nothing had happened. She said it was worth it. That week, she caught the eye of a nobleman's son. By the end of the month, she was married. By the end of the year, she was dead. Some said childbirth. Others said something in her blood, something that stopped her lungs one night as she slept. You do not speak her name aloud anymore, but her skin was always perfect. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You move now to the feet. They are the most stubborn. The soles have known too many floors, too many grains of stone, too many sharp-edged memories. You use the coarsest cloth here, made of woven palm fiber, dipped again in natron. You brace yourself and scrub. You wince. You do not stop. This is not about pain. This is about control. And the skin you leave behind smooth, glowing, scraped just enough to reflect the morning light is the skin the world will see. They will not know what it cost you. And that, too, is part of the offering. You finish with oil. Not much. Just a few drops almond and olive, warmed between your palms, pressed gently into the skin while it is still damp. The oil hisses softly against the raw patches. You do not flinch. You rub until it disappears, leaving only a sheen behind. You catch sight of yourself in the mirror, a bronze disc polished yesterday. its surface warped just enough to remind you that beauty is always an illusion. Your shoulders gleam. Your arms shine. You are sandstone now, burnished, holy, hard enough to withstand the gaze of others, soft enough to crack, if tapped just right. You pull your robe over your shoulders and begin the rest of your preparations, the kohl, the rouge, the scent, but none of it matters if the foundation isn't perfect. And today, it is. You will carry this skin into the market, into the temple, into the eyes of those who believe you are invulnerable. And when it begins to itch, when the red spreads across your chest like a question, when the corners of your mouth sting beneath the rouge, they will not know. They will only see the surface, the perfection, the sandstone, and they will never ask what lies beneath. It is said that in Egypt, the dead never truly left, that they lingered not as shadows or whispers, but as smells, that you could walk into a tomb sealed for 500 years and still catch the ghost of perfume, still smell the oils rubbed into brittle skin, still taste the resin that once made a corpse feel divine. You believe this because you have smelled it, not in a tomb, in the home of the embalmer's daughter. You were still young then, barely more than a girl curious enough to follow the wrong voices, polite enough to be let in where others might be turned away. Her house stood at the edge of the necropolis, where the land hardened into pale rock and the birds flew more slowly, as if even they respected the silence of the place. The daughter lived alone, in a building made of thick mud brick and cedar beams warped from the salt air. She wore no makeup, not even kohl, but her fingers were always stained with something dark, and her hair carried the scent of crushed herbs in sealed jars. The first time you entered, you thought the air was sweet, but it wasn't sweet, not truly. It was too still for sweetness. It was the scent of something finished, and yet still warm. She had smiled, offered you wine, and let you sit on a low stool beside the open window. On the table, a body lay under a linen cloth. Small, a child, perhaps, or what was left of one. She did not explain. She did not apologize. She only began to work. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You watched as she unwrapped the limbs, her hands steady and reverent. Not delicate, this was not a ceremony for show, but exact. She poured oil down the neck, massaged resin into the chest cavity, anointed the forehead with a paste so thick it stuck like sap, and then she reached for her jar. You remember that jar? Alabaster, smooth, carved with lotus flowers and something that looked like wings. She opened it, and the scent filled the room not immediately, but like water soaking into cloth. It expanded. It thickened the air. It made your mouth water and your stomach twist. It smelled of myrrh, of cedar, of blood dried under the sun, of breath that had stopped but not quite left. She touched it to the lips of the corpse, then the palms, then the soles of the feet. And then she looked at you and said, without emotion, "This is what lasts." Historians often marvel at the preservation methods of ancient Egypt, the natron, the oils, the binding rituals, but they rarely mention the fragrance, the idea that scent itself was part of the soul, that the dead were remembered not by their names, or even their faces, but by what lingered in the air after they were gone. You left that house in silence, but you carried the scent with you. For days, no matter how you scrubbed, how you oiled, how you prayed, it stayed. You smelled it in your linen, in your dreams, in your own mouth. You never went back, but you never forgot. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You smell it now, sometimes, in places where it should not be, in the folds of your own garments, after a long day near the brazier, in the corners of your room, when the wind shifts suddenly and the candle gutters. in the temples, especially in the temples, where incense smoke curls too slowly and refuses to rise. It has made you more careful about which oils you use, about which jars you open, about which scents you mix after dark. Because not all perfumes are for the living. You once made a blend for a widow, a different widow, older, fierce in her mourning. She asked for something strong, something that would make people step aside, something that would speak before she did. You gave her a mixture of frankincense, bitter orange, black myrrh, and a single drop of embalmer's oil. Just one. She wore it to the feast, and the room emptied around her. No one could say why. They only knew something had come in with her that was not hers, and it had stayed. You still have the recipe. You have never used it again. There are people who claim that the power of scent is illusion, that it cannot truly summon memory or sorrow, that it cannot call down ghosts or stir forgotten things from sleep. These people do not work with the dead, and they do not work with women, because women know the scent of a husband on a pillow 2 years after his death, the scent of a child on the cloth they were wrapped in, even after the rain has washed it, the scent of fear in your own armpits. When the man you painted this morning returns, looking different, smelling the same. These things do not lie, and they do not leave. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You close your cabinet now, sealing the jars of balm and oil, wrapping the cones, tying the linen strips around the unused pots. The scent of your room is layered rose, cedar, a trace of vinegar, and beneath it all, something darker. You light a small coil of Kai-Fi incense and let it burn low, until only smoke remains. Not enough to purify, just enough to remind you that you are here, that you are still warm, that you are not yet a memory. And yet, when you catch your reflection in the mirror, something in your face looks quieter, as though you've already begun to fade. You smooth your robes, tie your hair, and dab a bit of lotus oil at your temples. Something sweet, something soft, something only the living would wear. And you step into the hallway. There are clients waiting, bodies waiting, rooms waiting to be made clean, beautiful, holy. You will mix the oils. You will close the mouths. You will paint the lips. And the scent will rise, always rise, like a question without an answer, like the echo of a name that no one speaks aloud anymore, like the breath of the dead, still hanging in the air. There is a silence that lives beneath every ornament, every veil, every carefully arranged detail of beauty. It is not the silence of absence, nor of peace, but something more ancient, more patient, a silence that waits beneath the surface of things, like still water under a painted boat. And nowhere is that silence more carefully hidden than beneath the wigs of the women who serve in the palace. You have styled many of them, combed the strands of curled hair scented with iris root and frankincense, twisted braids into spirals and loops, stitched golden clasps into their base, painted tiny ribbons with beeswax to hold the curls tight against the scalp. You know that the wigs worn by these women, whether dancers, attendants, or wives, are not frivolous things. They are armor. They are status. They are expectation carved from strands. But you also know what lies beneath them: the sores, the scabs, the tender skin rubbed raw by heat and wax and time, the parts of the body not meant to be covered for hours in this heat, now pressed beneath layers of oil, false hair, and secrecy. You have seen the scalps when the wigs come off, the shine of sweat, the marks left behind by pins, the faint green line of mildew forming on the leather lining of a poorly dried headdress. You have heard the breath catch in a woman's throat when she removes the weight at the end of the day and feels her head again, not through pain, but through contrast, through the simple astonishment of air. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. There is one wig you remember more than the others. It belonged to a woman named Tiaret, a court scribe's daughter, promoted by beauty, married by silence. She came to you every 5 days, without fail, carrying her own mirror, her own comb, her own pot of scented grease. She never spoke much, but her eyes followed your hands with the kind of attention that made you feel she might be memorizing each movement. Her wig was extraordinarily long, layered, formed from black strands twisted with real lapis thread. It fell to her waist, shimmering slightly when she walked, its motion like water. But under that beauty, beneath that woven night, her scalp told a different story. It had cracked, not once, but many times. You had tried to offer alternatives, lighter wigs, looser styles, scalp salves made from aloe and river mint, but she refused each one. She said nothing, simply handed you the comb and looked away. Until one day, she didn't come. And then another day passed, then 2, then 7. You asked no questions, but the next time you saw her was in the temple courtyard, standing too far away for speech, her head bare, her scalp wrapped in linen, her mouth pressed into something that used to be a smile. She didn't wave, but she looked at you, and you knew. Historians still discuss the significance of wigs in ancient Egyptian culture. They talk about status, about heat, about fashion. They note how certain styles denoted rank, marital status, religious affiliation. They observe that even the dead were buried with wigs, often better than any they had worn in life. But what they rarely mention is the skin beneath, the cost, the quiet infections, the way beauty, when pressed too close to the body, begins to demand things. It begins by asking for your time, then your breath, then the nerves in your scalp, and then your silence. You have seen women who bled from beneath their wigs. You have seen women who tied them too tightly and fainted. You have seen women who removed them after years and could not recognize the person in the mirror without it. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You remember another woman older, a singer in the court, praised for her grace. Her wig was the color of burnt bronze, woven with strands of gold thread and small ivory beads shaped like lilies. She wore it so tightly that the skin on her forehead began to recede, her eyebrows disappearing into nothing. She asked you to paint new brows each week, just slightly lower each time. You did it, because what else could you do? You mixed the charcoal with gum arabic. You painted the lines. You handed her the mirror, and each time she looked into it, she said only, "Closer." Not to you, not to anyone, just to the reflection. Closer. You wanted to tell her she was still beautiful, but you didn't know if that would be kindness or cruelty. You still don't. Sometimes, when you are alone, you unroll your own hair, thick and unruly, uncooperative in the heat. You press a damp cloth to your scalp and close your eyes, and you wonder what your life would be like if you had accepted the offer to become one of the perfumed girls at court. If you had worn the gold, the lapis, the perfection, if you had pressed your thoughts down beneath a wig, let the world praise what it saw, and said nothing about what it didn't. You would have been clean, admired, unrecognizable, but you would not be whole. You know that now. The whisper beneath the wig is not just pain. It is the echo of the person who lives beneath performance. It is the voice that says, "I am here." Still, even when no one listens, even when everyone applauds, even when the gods themselves look away, you rise from your stool. You gather the strands of another woman's wig. You heat the oil. You prepare the comb. And you begin, because for now, your hands are steady, and your silence still listens. He had no name. At least not one anyone used anymore. Perhaps once, long ago, in a village swallowed by dust and memory, someone had called him by something soft, something shaped by affection or familiarity. But in the palace, among the storerooms and the echoes of commands, he was only boy, sometimes hands. Once, from a particularly cruel overseer, dust eater, but never a name, not one that mattered. He lived in the shadows of the temple's outer hall, sleeping curled behind the vats of oil, where the scent of crushed lotus clung to the floor, and the beeswax drippings hardened in uneven puddles. His world was measured in jars not by their beauty or their fragrance, but by their weight. Full jars meant work. Empty ones meant more work. Broken ones meant pain. And it was always the powders that took the most from him. He had been chosen, if one can call it that, because his fingers were small, nimble, and did not shake. Because his eyes could distinguish color better than the other boys, even in low light. Because he did not speak unless spoken to, and even then, only in whispers. Because once, when asked to grind a piece of cinnabar into a bowl, he did so without coughing, without tears, and without complaint, though his lips were stained red for 3 days afterward, and the roof of his mouth peeled like bark from an old tree. That was when the mistress of the powders noticed him. She called him forward, her robes heavy with scent, her skin gleaming with oil, her eyes lined with thick galena that made her gaze feel like the edge of something sharp. She asked him nothing. She simply handed him a bowl, pointed to the mortar, and nodded. And so he began. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The work was simple, but never easy. He ground stones bright, brittle, sharp, malachite, galena, red ochre, orpiment. He crushed petals dried in the shade until they bled, color again in oil. He stirred wax into liquid, turned resin into paste, scraped coal from the bottom of aging jars, and mixed it with new soot, breathing the smoke that never quite left his lungs. The powders coated everything. His fingers, blackened and dry, cracked beneath the nails. His arms, always covered in a fine sheen of glittering dust, shimmered even when he lay sleeping. His chest burned in the mornings, and he sometimes woke with blood on his lips. But he said nothing. There was no one to say it to, and even if there had been, he knew the answer already. The women wanted beauty, and beauty wanted his body. Not all at once, just a little at a time. The mistress was particular. She demanded consistency, smoothness, precision. No clumps, no air bubbles, no deviations in tone. He learned to test colors on strips of linen, on clay shards, once even on his own tongue, not because he had been told to, but because it let him understand the strength of a mixture in a way that even her eyes could not. And so the line between his work and his pain blurred, and then disappeared. Historians still wonder who made the cosmetics of ancient Egypt. They write about perfumers, scribes, priests. They guess at women's hands, at temple records, at royal recipes inscribed on scrolls and stored in secret chambers. But they rarely speak of the boys, the slaves, the silent ones, the ones who ground the powder until their bones ached and their breath failed and their names were forgotten, the ones who never wore what they made, the ones who never lived long enough to teach anyone else how. They think beauty is a ritual, but it is a labor, and every color has a cost. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. One evening, the boy made a mistake. He had been given a new shipment of lead-white cerussite, finely powdered, delicate, and dangerous. He had been tired. His arms hurt from carrying the grinding stone. His head was full of smoke from the incense in the great hall. He coughed once, just once, while pouring the powder into a mixing bowl, and the cloud that rose from the impact filled his mouth, his nose, his eyes. He dropped the bowl. It shattered. The powder drifted up in slow, soft waves, like ash from a funeral pyre. He fell to the floor and didn't get up. The mistress arrived moments later, her sandals silent, her expression unreadable. She looked at the mess. She looked at the boy. She said nothing. Then she called for another slave, and the boy was dragged from the room. You do not know what happened to him afterward. No one does. Some say he recovered. Others say he died that night, coughing red foam into the rag they wrapped around his face. One girl, another servant, whispered that she saw him 3 days later, standing in the temple gardens, hands wrapped in linen, eyes unfocused. But she never swore to it, and no one ever spoke his name again. You think of him now, sometimes, when you grind your own pigments, when you open a jar and feel the dust cling to your skin, when you catch the scent of vinegar and resin in your hair long after you've left the room. You wonder how much of his breath lives on in the powders the nobles still wear. How many queens painted their eyes with his life? How many dancers danced with his death on their cheeks? And whether anyone ever thanked him, you doubt it, because beauty does not thank its makers. It only asks for more. The first time you saw one, it startled you not because it was strange, but because it was familiar. It lay inside the tomb of a woman long dead, a noblewoman, her name carved into the limestone wall in looping, elegant strokes that whispered of marriages and landholdings and feasts in gardens long turned to dust. Her bones were arranged with care. Her amulets were placed in proper order. Her shroud was embroidered with the symbols of Isis and the promises of eternal rest. But what drew your eye first was the kit. It had been placed gently beside her feet, wrapped in dyed linen, stained with the memory of scented oil, tied with a cord fraying only slightly at the ends. You had seen dozens just like it, not in tombs, but on shelves in temple chambers, in the bedrooms of court wives, in the hands of dancers before they stepped onto polished stone to please an audience they could not see. It was a cosmetic box, a vanity case, a tool of the living, placed among the dead. Inside were 2 small jars of pigment, one black, one green, a flat bronze mirror, a thin comb, slightly cracked at the teeth, a stick of hardened rouge, and a faded bundle of linen cloths, each still faintly smelling of coal and age. These were not ceremonial objects. These were not symbols. These were tools, used, beloved, necessary. She had taken them with her, because she expected to use them again. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. In Egypt, death was not an end. It was an extension, a continuation, a passage that demanded preparation, no less serious than a wedding, a royal audience, or a festival of the gods. And just as one would never attend such events without dressing carefully, neither would a soul step into the afterlife unadorned. Beauty was not vanity. It was responsibility. It was identity. It was proof that you had cared for yourself in life, and therefore deserved care in death. You have prepared many such kits for the dead. You do not always know the names of those they will accompany. Sometimes a family brings you a list. Precise and expensive lapis powder, 3 shades of ochre, a full jar of rose-scented oil, a gold-plated mirror if it can be afforded. Sometimes they bring nothing but a request and a coin and a memory. And sometimes, as you open your fingers over the palette and begin to mix, you think about what the dead would ask for, if they could speak. Would they want the red they wore on their wedding day? Would they want the same kohl they used when they first looked into the eyes of someone they loved? Or would they choose something new, something softer, something they never dared wear when breath still ruled their face. Historians still catalog such kits in museums. They describe them in terms of function and ritual. They place them behind glass. They assign them to dynasties. They label them with phrases like cosmetic preparation box and funerary pigment jar, as though that captures their weight. But the truth is, those kits were not for show. They were not merely symbolic. They were necessary, because beauty did not stop at death. It followed. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You remember one woman in particular. Her name was Sefket. She died young. Not so young as to be called a child, but young enough that no one expected it. A fever, they said. A night of sweating and trembling and then stillness. You had painted her once, just weeks before, for a temple feast. She had chosen bold colors that day, dark Kohl, a wine-colored stain for her lips, and a shimmering gold dust for her arms and shoulders. She had laughed as you worked, asking if you thought she looked like a goddess. You had smiled and said yes, and she had believed you. When she died, her sister came to you. She wanted the same colors, exactly the same. She brought the original jars, half empty, crusted at the edges, still holding the scent of that night. She asked you to prepare a new kit, using only what was left. She said her sister would want it that way, that it was the last thing she had chosen for herself. You did as she asked. You crushed the powders again, carefully, so as not to waste a grain. You added fresh oil to the rouge to restore its softness. You tied the brushes together with a silk thread pulled from Sefket's own hair wrap. You placed everything in a lacquered box painted with the eye of Horus and the name of Hathor. And then, just before the box was sealed, you added a mirror, an old one, slightly tarnished, but still able to reflect, because you could not imagine her entering the next world without the ability to see herself. Because even in death, she deserved to be beautiful. You think of that often now, when you pass the shelves of tools in your chamber, when you touch a brush that once painted joy and now paints silence. You think of how much of yourself you have sent into the ground, how many of your colors sleep beside bones, how many mirrors reflect only dust. And still, you mix, you prepare the jars, you clean the brushes, because the living may lie, but the dead do not forget, and beauty, once promised, must be fulfilled. She was too young. Even before she opened her mouth, before her eyes met yours, before the servant behind her finished announcing her name in that unsteady voice that carried more hesitation than pride. You knew. You could see it in the way her sandals dragged slightly as she walked, in the way she clutched the small pouch in her left hand with such force her knuckles had turned white. She wore no jewelry, no perfume, no veil, just a simple linen tunic, clean, pressed, unembellished, and an expression that hovered between confusion and reluctant obedience. She was not a client you would have expected. She sat where you told her to sit, knees close together, hands still gripping the pouch, now nestled in her lap. When she finally met your eyes, you were struck by how still she was, not the practiced stillness of a noblewoman trained to keep her face unreadable, nor the languid grace of a dancer who knew how to move by not moving, but the rigid stillness of someone afraid to disturb anything around her. She did not speak. So you did. Do you know what you'd like? She nodded, barely, then opened the pouch. Inside was a tiny box, worn, unadorned. The lid was chipped at one corner, and its clasp had been replaced with a loop of string. It was the kind of box you might find buried at the bottom of an older woman's vanity, the kind used long ago when supplies were scarce and beauty was a luxury rationed across days. She set it between you on the floor without a word. You opened it. The rouge inside was pale, nearly dry, cracked at the center like parched earth. You recognize the recipe: immediately crushed red clay, mixed with linden ash and a trace of date syrup. Once softened by fig oil, now long evaporated. It was a child's blend, a beginner's paint, the sort given to girls to practice with in secret, mimicking their mothers before the mirror when no one was watching. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You looked up, gently. She was watching your hands. You asked, "Where did you get this?" Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then she pointed to herself. It was yours, a nod from before. A longer pause, then another nod. How old were you? She didn't answer, but you knew. You closed the box. You asked if she wanted it restored. She hesitated, then said, very quietly, "It's the only one I trust." And with that, you understood. She had been promised, maybe not in words, but in arrangements and gifts and careful conversations held between adults who never once asked if she was ready. A man had been chosen. A date had been set. The oils had been bought, the linens woven, the guest list carved into a roll of papyrus. And now, as the world rearranged itself around her without her permission, she had come to you not for transformation, not for enhancement, but for protection, for something familiar, for something that still belonged to her. You dipped your fingers into a jar of almond oil and let a single drop fall into the center of the cracked rouge. It soaked in slowly, darkening the red to something closer to rust. You stirred carefully with the handle of a brush, not to erase the crack, but to soften it, to give it breath again. Then you asked her to close her eyes. Historians rarely mention the brides. They speak of queens, of priestesses, of concubines in the harems of powerful men. They write of beauty as a symbol of fertility, of wealth, of divine favor. But they do not write of the girl who sits in a stranger's chamber, asking to wear the same rouge she once smeared on her face as a joke before her sisters laughed and her mother caught her and told her not to grow up so fast. They do not write about the fear. They do not write about the silence. They do not write about the way your hand must not shake as you lift the pigment to her face and begin to color the lips of someone who still does not fully understand why she must be colored at all. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You worked slowly, tracing the outline of her mouth with a care that went beyond cosmetic. The red wasn't bright. It wasn't seductive. It was soft, faint, like a memory. You applied only enough to honor the gesture, to make her reflection feel like a version of herself instead of someone else's creation. She didn't open her eyes until you told her to. When she did, she blinked, not in recognition, not in awe, but in relief. You handed her a mirror, a simple one, flat and bronze, not polished enough to flatter, but clear enough to be honest. She looked for a long time, then she nodded once. You asked, "Would you like Kohl for your eyes?" She shook her head. You offered scent lotus or myrrh. She said, "No smell." You did not argue. You wiped your hands and rewrapped the box, tying the lid again with the same string it had arrived with. You placed it back in her pouch, gently, as though sealing something sacred. As she rose to leave, you reached for another small jar. This one hidden behind the others, rose clay and almond oil. No lead, no additives. You pressed it into her palm. "For tomorrow," you said. She looked at you, startled. "What for?" And you said, "In case you wake up and want to choose something else." She did not answer, but she did not let go of the jar. She tucked it into her sleeve and walked out, head bowed, not from shame, but from the weight of everything she had yet to carry. You cleaned the brushes in silence. You drained the bowl. You packed the room as usual. But the next morning, Before you opened your chamber to the other clients, you painted your own lips with the same red. And for the first time in a long while, you looked in the mirror and remembered being small. Remembered that sometimes beauty is not about being seen. Sometimes it is about surviving the moment when no one is looking. There are no windows here, not even slits cut high into the wall to let in air or light. The only illumination comes from two narrow oil lamps, one near the threshold, where the stone floor gives way to packed clay, and one further in, mounted on the wall above a narrow shelf that holds half a dozen pigment jars, a fan made of dyed reeds, and a basin crusted with mineral residue. The air in this room is thick with the scent of heat, resin, and something older, something that lingers not on the surface, but in the walls, in the corners, in the crevices of the bricks themselves, something like sweat mixed with perfume, something like effort sealed in wax. You descend the narrow staircase carefully, each step dipping slightly in the center from generations of feet carrying trays, bowls, water, powders, and silence. No one speaks when entering this room. It is understood. The women who come here arrive wrapped in linen, already clean, already prepared in the ways the outer world demands, hairpinned, hands washed, breath sweetened with mint. But what happens here is not for the outer world. This is the transformation chamber. The heart behind the painted mask. You reach the bottom step and step into a silence that is not empty. Two women are already here. One is older, seated on a small stool, her posture proud but her fingers trembling as she attempts to open a jar of dark kohl. Her hair is graying beneath her wrap, and though she wears the robes of a high-ranking wife, there is something weary in the slope of her shoulders. The other is younger, possibly her servant or assistant, standing quietly behind her, hands clasped, eyes not meeting yours. She's been here before. You place your tools on the stone counter. You do not speak. You begin. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The makeup room beneath the palace is not part of the official floor plan. It does not appear on any scroll or diagram. When guests are led through the royal halls, when scribes record the layout of the queen's quarters or the chambers of the concubines, this room is never mentioned. It was built long ago, perhaps in the reign of a forgotten king, carved into the rock behind the western wing, near the servants' passage. Over time, it became more than convenience. It became tradition. Only those who serve beauty at the highest levels know of it, and even fewer are allowed to work here. You are one of them. You earned your place, not by name or blood, but by skill. You knew how to draw a perfect line without waste. You understood how to mix red clay with vinegar until it clung to skin like breath. You learned which oils glowed beneath torchlight and which ones turned sour in heat. And most importantly, you listened. You listened when the women said nothing. You listened when their mouths told one story and their eyes told another. You listened to the silence of the room and knew exactly when to speak, and exactly when to keep your voice inside your hands. The older woman now sits in front of you. She places her hands in her lap. Her palms are stained faintly pink, perhaps from washing too often, perhaps from clutching something too tightly. You ask if she wants her usual shade. She nods, slowly. You begin with the eyes. The kohl has thickened slightly since last you used it, so you warm the bowl with the edge of your palm, stirring it slowly until it returns to form. You dip the applicator and draw the line one continuous motion, from inner corner to outer, curving upward slightly, just enough to lift her expression without drawing attention to the motion. Then the other side. You know this face. You have painted it before state dinners, before funerals, before nights when she knew she would be summoned. You have seen it in pleasure, in dread, in stillness. She does not move. She lets you paint. You move to the lips next. The rouge she prefers is darker than most women her age would choose. But it suits her. It gives her mouth strength. It reminds people that she once stood beside kings, that she once spoke with men who ruled cities, that she remembers how to speak still. You apply it in 3 passes, 1 for each marriage, 1 for each loss. And then you stop. You do not offer powder for the cheeks. You do not offer shimmer for the collarbone. Not today. She meets your eyes in the mirror, and then she says something she has never said before. I want to look like I'm not trying. And you understand immediately. She does not want to look plain. She wants to look effortless. She wants to look like she woke like this, like her power never came from paint, though you both know it always did. You take a cloth. You soften the edges of her kohl. You blur the color at the corners of her lips. You dab a single dot of oil behind her ears. And when she rises, she looks less like a queen and more like a woman who has nothing left to prove. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. She leaves the room in silence. The servant follows. Neither of them looks back. You remain. The lamps burn lower now. The next appointment won't arrive for an hour. You clean your tools, wipe the edge of the counter, rewrap the brushes in cloth. And then, for a moment, you sit. You think of all the women who have passed through this room, all the secrets painted into their cheeks, all the questions shaped into their brows, all the silences trapped between layers of pigment and powder. This is not just a room. It is a confessional, a battlefield, a sanctuary where no one kneels, but everyone surrenders something. You once dreamed of painting the faces of goddesses. Now you know, goddesses bleed too. They just learned to hide it beneath gold. The brushes were always warm to the touch, not because they had been left by the fire, and not because the sun had reached them through some hidden slit in the wall, but because the copper absorbed everything: your hands, your breath, your intention. The copper remembered. It held the heat of every face you had touched with it, every jawline you had shaded, every cheekbone you had highlighted, every pair of eyes you had lined with trembling precision in the moments just before a woman was led away. There were 5 brushes in your set. You never needed more. Each had its purpose, its rhythm, its whisper. The narrow-tipped one, shaped like the edge of a reed and wrapped in silver thread, was for the waterline, the inner rim of the lower lid, where you could never afford to tremble. The wider one, flattened slightly at the end, was for powdered gold and crushed lapis, designed to sweep across the lid without leaving harsh edges. One was dedicated solely to blending worn nearly to a nub from years of gentle smudging, never washed with water, only wiped clean with cloths and a breath of oil. And the last 2 sisters, really, in shape and size, were for precision, for final touches, for decisions you could not reverse. You kept them wrapped in dyed linen, each brush resting in its own fold, each tip protected, each handle carefully polished once per week with a mixture of olive oil and vinegar. It was not vanity, it was respect. They were your only true inheritance. You had received them from a woman who had once served the queen's grandmother, who had learned from someone else before her, who had painted the faces of women now gone, their likenesses carved into the walls of tombs, still staring out with perfect eyes. And it was with these brushes you were called, one evening, to prepare the face of a woman condemned. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You had heard the rumors, everyone had, that she had been caught with letters, that she had spoken to someone she was not permitted to know, that she had smiled when she should have wept, or wept when she should have smiled. No one told you the truth. No one ever did. But you knew that when a face was painted before death, it was not a ritual, it was a reminder. It was a gesture of control. You had painted brides. You had painted widows. You had painted priestesses and dancers and mothers who no longer recognized the children in their arms. But this was different. There was no celebration, no mourning, just silence. They brought her in wearing plain robes, not white, not black, a dull brown, like the walls of the holding chamber where they kept her for the final night. Her hair was unbound. Her hands were not tied, but they were clenched so tightly that you could see her nails pressing half moons into her palms. She sat before you without looking up. You did not ask what she wanted. You only asked, "Have you worn Kohl before?" She nodded. You asked, "Would you like it done the same way?" And she said, "Wider." So you began. You used the darkest Kohl you had mixed from galena, cedar soot, and the ash of dates. You softened it with water from the priest's basin, heated just enough to bloom the scent of the earth. You dipped the narrow brush and touched the base of her lashes, working outward with slow, even strokes. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She simply watched you in the mirror. And as you painted, she began to speak. She told you about her mother's mirror-polished bronze, always cold, always cracked in the same corner. She told you about the time she first wore Kohl, how she had smeared it across her temple by mistake and laughed so hard her father forbade her from wearing it again for a month. She told you about the day she decided never to cry again, not because she was strong, but because she hated the way tears ruined the corners of her eyes. She told you that she had only ever been kissed by one man, and that he had never once seen her without paint. You said nothing. You kept painting. Historians will write that Egyptians believed Kohl protected the eyes, that it shielded from sun, that it deflected the evil eye, that it healed infections. And perhaps all of that is true. But what they will not say, what they cannot know, is that sometimes the act of painting the eye is a final resistance, a way to say, "You may take my breath, but you will not take the version of myself I have chosen to show you." If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You moved to her lips. She did not ask for red. She said, "No color." But you applied a thin sheen of oil enough to catch the light, enough to make her mouth look like a question never asked. It was the softest thing you did all night. And when you were done, she stood. She looked at herself in the mirror. She touched the edge of her brow. She said, "Good." And she left. She walked from your chamber with her spine straight, her face quiet, her eyes lined like the statues of queens. And the next morning, when the procession passed through the square and the sentence was read, and the people turned away, it was her eyes they remembered. Not the guards, not the crime, not the silence. Her eyes. You cleaned the brushes with oil that night, each one, slowly, thoroughly, until the Kohl no longer bled onto the cloth. Then you rewrapped them. You placed them back in their folds. And you did not use them for 7 days. Not out of grief, but out of honor, because those brushes had touched defiance. And defiance, once worn on the face, never quite fades. There are sounds in the world that never quite leave you, not because they are loud or sharp or terrifying, but because they are soft in ways you never expect, soft in a way that clings to your skin, your bones, your sleep. And of all the sounds you have carried with you across the years, across chambers and streets and seasons, none has ever stayed the way the song of the river lotus has. It was not a literal song, of course. The lotus did not sing, not in the way people do, not in the way birds cry, not in the way girls whisper when they think no one hears. But if you ever sat beside the Nile at dusk, just as the sun began its slow descent behind the far bank, just as the heat loosened its grip on your spine, just as the air filled with the thick perfume of warm earth and still water, you would swear that the lotus moved to music. You would swear that, as the petals unfolded, they made a sound not from their mouths, but from the way they existed, the way they opened, the way they refused to bloom in the sun's presence, choosing instead the quiet hours. That, to you, was song. The bath was shallow, not meant for washing. It was carved from sandstone, ringed with smooth stone benches, and hidden behind a courtyard few people visited. Only the women of the upper quarters used it, those favored by the court, by the priests, by the architects of law and pleasure. It was lined with lotus flowers, freshly plucked each morning by boys who rose before the call of prayer to wade into the reeds and return with armfuls of petals that still glistened with dew. You were summoned there only rarely, because the women who came to that bath were not in need of transformation. They were in need of forgetting. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. She had no name that she gave you. She entered the chamber already disrobed, her body barely covered in linen, so sheer it may as well have been woven from breath. Her skin was pale, not from blood, but from oil, from milk, from treatments that had polished her to the consistency of marble. Her eyes were rimmed in thick lines, not fresh, but faded, as though she had not removed her paint in days. Her mouth was bare, her feet were silent. She lowered herself into the bath without ceremony, the water swallowing her slowly. It did not steam, it did not bubble, it simply accepted her. You stood nearby, waiting. You had brought nothing, no box, no pigments, no tools, only a jar. Inside that jar was the oil of the river lotus distilled over weeks, strained through linen, stored in the dark. It was not made for scent. It was made for surrender. She reached for it without looking at you. You handed it over without breathing, and she poured it across her chest in one slow, unbroken motion. The smell unfurled, not like perfume sharp and immediate, but like memory, warm, damp, heavy. It smelled like the banks of the river when you were 10 years old, kneeling in the mud, watching your reflection warp in the shallows as dragonflies hovered above your scalp. It smelled like your mother's skin after she returned from the harvest, soaked in sweat and joy and the dirt of survival. It smelled like the temple floor at dusk, when the last priest left and the silence was finally yours. It smelled like everything you had forgotten you missed. And in that moment, she began to hum. It wasn't a melody you recognized. It wasn't even a melody, not really. Just a pattern, a vibration, a repetition of notes that circled each other like reeds in the current. It wasn't meant for you. But you heard it anyway, and you knew, without question, that this was the sound the lotus made when it bloomed. Historians will tell you that the blue lotus was sacred in Egypt, that it symbolized rebirth, eternity, the sun, the cycles of day and night, that it adorned the heads of gods and the fingers of the dead, that it was consumed in wine, smoked in rituals, steeped in oils, and burned in offerings. All of that is true, but they will not tell you what it feels like to sit beside someone who no longer belongs to this world and listen to her hum a tune only the flowers understand. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. She remained in the water until the oil coated her completely, until her shoulders gleamed like the Nile under moonlight, until her hair clung to her back like silk weighted with sorrow, until the humming stopped. And then she wept. Not loudly, not with drama or gasps or movement. Her eyes simply opened, and water left them. You did not touch her. You did not speak, because nothing you could say would have been worthy of her grief. And because the oil did what it was made to do, it softened everything, even pain. When she stood, the water barely moved. She walked past you, oil still dripping from her wrists. She did not ask for a cloth. She did not look back. You stayed there, long after she was gone. You dipped your fingers into the bath. You touched the water to your face. And for a moment, you, too, forgot your name. The oil remains in your chamber now, hidden behind other jars, used only when nothing else works. You do not speak of it. You do not sell it. You do not wear it to impress. You wear it only when silence is heavier than sorrow. And you listen, always, for the song that follows. Not from your lips, but from the petals, unfurling, opening, singing. She had lived through 5 rains at least, that's what the archivist said, though none could be entirely sure whether the first 2 counted, since she was not yet queen then, but only daughter, niece, ornament. And yet, when she entered a room, even the priests bowed a little lower than custom required, not because they feared her, though many did, but because she carried the weight of permanence. She moved with the certainty of stone pillars, with the calm of hieroglyphs carved into temple walls, meant to last long after names faded from memory. She was not a young woman. That was obvious to anyone who looked closely, who dared to observe the corners of her eyes or the slow precision of her breath. But her face was not what it should have been. Not at her age, not after so many winters. You were summoned to her quarters at dusk, when the light was soft enough to forgive imperfections, but still honest enough to reveal the work left undone. The corridor smelled of crushed lotus and old parchment, and the guards at her door didn't speak when you arrived. They only stepped aside, letting you pass into a silence so heavy it seemed to press against your skin. Inside, the chamber was cool, shaded, draped with gauze that fluttered not from wind, but from the movement of servants who never made a sound. She sat at her table, mirror already in place, hands folded across her lap, eyes sharp as obsidian knives. Her skin gleamed, not with sweat, not with oil, but with something cooler, something more foreign, a sheen that did not reflect the flicker of the lamp, but absorbed it, held it, dimmed it. And you knew, before she even spoke, what she had done. She wore mercury. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. It was not common. It was not even approved. The temple physicians warned against it. The scrolls described its power with caution. Not reverence, but power. Once tasted, once seen on the surface of the skin, becomes difficult to let go. The queen did not believe in aging, not because she feared death. She had already prepared her tomb, her statues, her canopic jars, but because she feared erosion, the idea that time could take her image, soften it, blur it, change the way she was remembered. So she painted herself with mercury paste, mixed not with water but with rose oil, thinned just enough to spread evenly across the cheeks, the brow, the neck. It masked the lines. It cooled the skin. It made her appear not younger, exactly, but preserved, like alabaster, like a thing designed to be displayed rather than touched. You said nothing. You picked up the brush. You began your work. The first layer had to be reinforced. The paste had begun to flake near her temple. You mixed the fresh application carefully, wearing gloves that the palace had provided not out of concern for your health, but for her cleanliness. You applied it with a slow, circling motion, avoiding her eyes, which never left yours in the mirror. She asked, after a long pause, "Does it look natural?" You considered your answer carefully. Then you said, "It looks like you have not changed." She nodded, and that was enough. Historians still debate, whether Egyptian queens used mercury. There is evidence traces in tomb residues, notes in the private diaries of court scribes, mentions in medicinal papyri, but few agree on how often or how widely it was used. Some believe it was a rumor, a foreign practice imported from alchemical travelers. Others believe it was a symbol, something done rarely but spoken of often, like the wearing of gold in mourning or the sacrificing of doves at childbirth. But you have no doubt, because you touched it, you applied it, and you saw what it did. The skin beneath mercury becomes pale, yes, but it also begins to tighten, to crack. The pores shrink, the blood slows. After long use, the cheeks grow stiff, the lips dry no matter how much oil you press into them. But the queen did not care. She would rather look cold than soft. She would rather look eternal than kind. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You continued with her eyes. She still wore Kohl, thick, black, drawn with the same brush her mother had once used. She insisted on that. It was part of her identity, part of the image carved into statues, painted on murals, burned into the eyes of those who bowed too slowly. You applied it carefully, knowing that one wrong stroke would not be corrected with cloth, but with silence, with exile, perhaps worse. She asked about the lips. She always asked last. Today she chose coral, not red, not the deeper stain of youth. Coral was the color of maturity, of confidence, of sun fading into night. You applied it with a short, flat brush, blending it into the natural lines without erasing them completely. She approved. She always did. When you finished, you stepped back. She leaned forward. She examined every angle, the light, the shadow, the shift of her expression when she turned her head by a single degree. She did not blink. She did not breathe. And then she said, very quietly, "It will do." You packed your tools in silence. She did not thank you. As you left the room, one of the servants, the youngest, a girl no older than 10, brushed past you carrying a fresh jar. It was sealed with gold wax and marked with the sigil of the alchemist. You did not need to ask what was inside. You remembered your own hands, how, after your first application, they had stung, how, after the third, your nails had begun to flake, how, even now, your fingertips sometimes trembled without cause. You remembered a woman who had painted herself with mercury every day for 10 years. She died smiling, but her teeth had turned black. The soldiers came not in triumph, but in dust, not with banners, but with blisters, their armor dull with sun and sand, their mouths cracked, their feet wrapped in cloth soaked through with sweat and silence. They arrived in the middle of the 5th week, long after the first rumors had hardened into certainty, long after the women in the palace had stopped asking where their sons had gone, and long after the scribes had grown tired of recording names that would not return. The war was still far away, they said, but war has a way of walking faster than fear. And now it stood at the threshold of the city, carried on the backs of men whose eyes refused to look too long at anything that did not bleed. You were summoned to the eastern barracks, a place you had never been before. It smelled not of flowers or oils or incense, but of metal, old leather, and the rot that gathers between toes left too long in boots that do not fit. You were told it was for inspection, which made little sense. You were not a physician. You were not a healer. You were a painter, a woman whose trade was beauty, whose hands knew the language of faces, not wounds. But they insisted. And so you went. The room they led you to was dim, shielded by heavy linen draped across wooden beams. Inside sat 6 soldiers, some young, some broken, all silent, They watched you without interest, not because they were unkind, but because they had forgotten what it meant to be looked at with anything other than calculation. In the center of the room was a small table with a single jar of Kohl, uncapped, already smudged at the rim. You recognized the blend. It was yours, from your own storeroom. Taken without permission, then used. You asked, "Who applied this?" No one answered, but one of the younger soldiers, the one with his shoulder wrapped in dirty linen, glanced at the man beside him, older, gaunter, his right cheek lined with a scar that looked too clean to have come from battle. The man said, "We do it now, before going out, not for them, for us." You nodded. You understood more than he realized. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. Kohl had always been worn by warriors. It was not new. It was not vanity. It was protection. The sun in the desert was merciless. The dust even more so. But more than that, there was something in the act itself, the ritual, the repetition that made facing death easier. To line your eyes before stepping onto the battlefield was to say, "I have already seen what you cannot." It was to say, "I am not afraid to be seen." You uncapped your own jar and began to mix. The soldiers didn't speak, but they didn't resist. They sat as you moved from one to the next, applying the black pigment with slow, practiced strokes. You didn't ask for preferences. You didn't need to. You painted as they needed to be painted, not with artistry, but with precision. You thickened the lines at the corners, not for drama, but for shadow. You narrowed the inner edges to make their eyes look harder, colder, less human. You didn't erase their pain. You framed it. And with each line, you felt something return. Not to you, to them. Their backs straightened, their breath slowed, their silence shifted, not gone, but grounded. Historians will argue endlessly over why Egyptian warriors wore Kohl. Some will say it was, for medical reasons, galena, to protect against infection, the sharp pigments to deflect light. Others will say it was spiritual, a way of invoking the eye of Horus, to carry divine sight into the field of chaos. But none of them will mention this room. None of them will speak of the man who trembled until the brush touched his face, and then grew still. You moved to the last soldier, older than the rest, his beard flecked with gray, his eyes bloodshot. He didn't speak when you approached, didn't flinch when you raised your hand, but when you touched the brush to his skin, he said, "My wife used to do this." You paused. He added, "Before I left, every time. Said it made me look like someone who would come back." You said nothing, but you steadied your hand, and when you finished, he looked at you, nodded once, and turned away. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You packed your tools slowly. No one moved to stop you. As you turned to leave, the older soldier spoke again. "Why do you still do this?" he asked. You looked at him and said, "Because someone always needs it." He nodded again, not in understanding, just in acknowledgement. Outside, the light was too bright. The wind smelled of ash. You walked back through the city with your jars wrapped in linen, your brushes cleaned but not quite clean, your heart heavy but intact. That night, you mixed a new batch of Kohl, stronger, darker, faster to dry. You poured it into 6 jars and sealed them with cloth. You left them at the barracks before sunrise. You did not wait to see who would take them, but you knew they would be used, not because war makes men vain, but because, in the hour before death, beauty is not luxury. It is defiance. It is armor made of ash and shadow, and it begins before the sun even rises, long before the drums are struck, or the dancers awaken, or the priests open the temple doors to release the scent of cedar and wine into the waiting streets. It begins in the dark, always in the dark, with women seated on stone benches in cramped storerooms lit by oil lamps that flicker under the weight of so many breaths, with jars uncapped, brushes aligned like soldiers, palettes smeared in colors so rich they look like stolen fruit. It begins with laughter. Yes, but not the kind meant for crowds. It is a private kind of laughter, low and close, and sometimes sharp. The kind that says, we know what we are about to become, and we are becoming it together. You are there, as you have always been, before the first bell rings through the courtyard. You have already washed your hands 3 times, already opened the boxes of pigment you prepared the night before, already crushed the rose petals into paste and mixed them with the powdered cinnamon and fig to make the stain that will carry through sweat and sunlight. You have tied your hair back. You have warmed your tools. You have prayed not to a god, but to the pigment itself, to the strange alchemy that allows you to conjure transformation with nothing more than powder and oil. And they come to you one by one, some shy, some gleeful, some already humming the songs they will sing by afternoon, some quiet as stone, blinking slowly as if their souls have not yet caught up with their bodies. They sit, and you begin. There is no instruction, no discussion. You know what to do. You know which girl wants her cheeks bright enough to be seen from the steps of the temple, and which one prefers her beauty hidden in shadows, dark kohl, minimal rouge, a mouth painted just enough to suggest warmth, never flame. You begin with the eyes, always with the eyes, because that is where the mask begins. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. The festival of painted faces is older than memory, older than the city itself, older perhaps than the river it celebrates. It is not religious, not officially. No god claims it, no papyrus outlines its origins. It is a people's celebration, a rebellion against forgetting, a day when everyone becomes a version of themselves that might have been or might still be. It is the only time of year when servants paint their faces with the same gold as their mistresses, when dancers wear the same red as queens, when children wear eyeliner shaped like the eyes of falcons, when men do not pretend not to care. It is a day when all are beautiful and all are masked. You finish the third girl thick brows, violet paint across the lids, a line of kohl that turns upward like a question and turn to the next. She's new, younger than the others, nervous. You can tell by the way she touches her face, again and again, trying to imagine the transformation before it happens. You ask if she has a color in mind. She says nothing at first, then whispers, something bold. You smile. Bold is a language you speak fluently. You choose the copper pigment, mixed with a touch of wine resin, something that will shimmer beneath the sun but glow in shade. You apply it slowly, brushing from the center of her eyelid outward in careful sweeps. She doesn't blink, not even once. When you finish, you hand her a mirror. She gasps, not dramatically, but with the awe of someone seeing a possibility they had never considered. She does not thank you. She just touches her face, gently, as if afraid it will disappear. You move on. By the time the sun clears the temple roof, the room smells like celebration oil, sweat, pigment, flour, heat. The girls are dancing now, spinning slowly in place, practicing the movements they will repeat 100 times before dusk. You take a moment to lean against the wall and watch them. And then you see it, the rash. It begins small, just below one girl's jaw, a patch of red, blooming like shame. She hasn't noticed it yet. Neither have the others. You watch as she laughs, tips her head back, the pigment on her cheek catching the light like a promise. but the skin beneath her ear is blistering. You approach carefully. You ask her what she used to wash her face. She says, "Something my mother gave me." You ask to see it. She pulls a small jar from her satchel. You open it. The smell is wrong, too sour, too sharp. There's vinegar in it, and something else, something metallic. You ask if she mixed this with her rouge. She nods. You sigh, but you do not scold. Not today. You clean the spot with oil, gently, slowly. She winces. You reapply only a thin layer of paint, nothing more. You warn her not to let the sun strike that side of her face directly. You give her your scarf. She looks afraid. You touch her chin. You say, "You are still beautiful." She believes you, because today, everyone must. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. By midday, the procession begins. You are not among them. Your work is not to walk, not to sing, not to be seen. Your work is to make sure they are seen the way they wish to be. You remain in the chamber, mixing more paste. Wiping brushes clean with cloths, stained the color of joy and longing and mistakes. You hear their voices echo across the courtyard, laughter, shouting, song. You hear the bells tied to their ankles. You hear the music begin. And you know that soon, one of them will return, not for touch-ups, not for repairs, but because the pigment will have reacted with the sun. It always does. The girls forget. They drink. They dance too hard. They sweat. They lean against walls made of stone that still remember the heat of morning. And then their skin begins to burn beneath the beauty. It is not their fault. You prepare aloe paste. You cool rose water. You crush mint into the oil. And when they come back one by one, in pairs, barefoot and flushed and breathless, you do not ask what happened. You do not tell them they should have been more careful. You only clean their faces. You only whisper, "Let me fix it." Because this is what beauty means on this day. Not perfection, but care. Not elegance, but empathy. Not mask, but memory. By nightfall, the paint has faded. The colors have bled. The gold has tarnished. The rouge has cracked. But the joy, however brief, remains in their eyes. And the festival is over. You sit alone in the chamber, the last oil lamp guttering, your own face streaked with pigment you did not bother to remove. You stare into the mirror, too. You ask yourself if you will still be beautiful tomorrow. And the mirror, kind for once, does not answer. There are moments in the woman's life when the pigment on her lips does not feel like a choice, not like an adornment for celebration, seduction, or power, but something closer to a sentence, a visible brand not of fashion, but of humiliation, of enforcement, of submission masked in ritual. It does not begin with violence, not at first. It begins with stillness, a summons, a nod, the brief gesture of an overseer's hand, a request that is not a request, a phrase passed like the coin. She spoke too freely. That is all it takes. You are led through corridors not lined with tapestries or open to air, but damp and narrow, their walls stained with moisture that never seems to dry. Even in high summer, the women who walk with you wear no ornament. They do not speak, but their silence is heavier than judgment. They do not touch you, and yet you feel handled, guided not by grip, but by expectation. You try to count your steps. You fail. There are no windows, only smoke, the faint scent of copper, and the sour sharpness of something you recognize instinctively as rot. When you arrive, there is no guard. There is only a bench, a bowl, and a single brush resting on a cloth. You do not see the pigment until you kneel. Then it is there in a small clay jar, unmarked, uncapped, waiting. The liquid inside is red, not the red of roses, or wine, or crushed hibiscus, but a deeper red, viscous and matte, like blood congealed in the bottom of a sacrificial basin. You do not need to be told to open your mouth. You already have. The woman dips the brush. She does not speak. She touches the pigment to your bottom lip first, then the top, then back again. It is not a gentle stroke. It is not art. It is a coating, a silencing. The fluid is warm, strangely so, and it burns not immediately, but gradually, like heat pressing from within rather than applied from without. Your lips begin to swell before the brush leaves your skin. You do not cry out. That would defeat the purpose. This is not punishment in the way men punish with whips, with chains, with confinement. This is older, deeper. This is correction wrapped in the language of tradition, a ritual with no official name but one known to every girl who has ever dared to speak at the wrong time, in the wrong way, to the wrong man. They call it the red silence, not aloud, but among themselves. You are left to sit. For how long? You cannot say. The pain does not peak. It pulses. It rises like tide, ebbs, then returns sharper. Your tongue thickens. Your mouth dries. You breathe only through your nose, and even that becomes difficult. You hear nothing but your own breath, and the soft settling of pigment as it dries and hardens like clay across your lips. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. When the woman returns, she does not look at your face. She hands you a mirror, not bronze, not polished, just a shard of something reflective. You see yourself in pieces, a lip swollen beyond recognition, a face pale with effort, eyes wide, not with shock, but with comprehension. You look like someone else, someone who has learned something without words. You are dismissed, not with a gesture, just a silence heavier than stone. You rise slowly, your knees ache, your spine protests. You walk without guidance now, back through the halls where no one sees you. You pass others. They look down. No one asks. They know. When you reach your chamber, you do not speak. You reach for a bowl of cool water. Dip a cloth. Press it to your lips. The pain does not recede. It hovers. You do not remove the pigment. You cannot. Not yet. You must wear it for a day. At least a day. That is the rule. Not written, but enforced. You sleep without dreaming. You wake with blood on the cloth, the stain dark against white linen. You wash your mouth with oil and salt. It takes hours to peel the layer free. Your skin beneath is raw, tender. Your mouth opens only in slivers. You do not speak for 3 more days, and when you finally do, your voice is different. Not quieter, just slower, measured. You choose words like pigment now, carefully, deliberately. And when another girl is brought to your chamber young, trembling, her mouth already stained, you take her hand. You do not ask what she said. You do not need to. You crush fig and honey and mint. You apply the mixture to her lips with your fingers. You hold the cloth while she weeps. You say only one thing. It fades. Historians will not find records of these moments. No scroll describes the punishment of paint. No statue bears the face of a woman silenced by color. But those who worked in the court, who painted lips with reverence and fear, they remember. They remember every girl who flinched when rouge was offered, every woman who preferred balm to pigment, every face that turned from the mirror when the color was too close to memory. And you remember too, not because of the pain, but because of what it taught you that beauty, once weaponized, never forgets the hand that held the blade. It was the kind of summer that made walls bleed. the sun, high and merciless, hovered over the palace like a verdict, not a blessing. And the stones beneath your feet were so hot that you had to wrap your sandals in wet cloth just to cross from one courtyard to another. The air itself seemed thickened by heat, refusing to move, trapping every breath like incense in a sealed jar. People did not speak above a whisper. They did not laugh. They conserved their words the way they conserved their water, carefully, reverently, and with a growing sense of desperation. And so, as always in seasons of desperation, the body became the site of experiment. The priest-physicians, those cautious scribes of bone and bile, recommended thick unguents made from palm oil and powdered alabaster. The wealthier women smeared their limbs in crushed pearls and the marrow of figs, whispering prayers to Sekhmet beneath their breath. But the most powerful those who had servants not only to dress them, but to breathe near them when they felt faint, used something else. Something older, something sacred, or so they said. They used the crocodile dung sunscreen. You had never touched it before. You had only heard the stories that circled in the kitchens and among the linens. Stories about queens who never burned, about dancers who could twirl in the sun without shade, about concubines whose skin stayed pale as ivory even after days of temple parades. The dung was mixed with honey, rosewater, and sometimes a pinch of natron to keep it from rotting too quickly. It was said to draw out heat, to reflect the sun, to preserve not only beauty but health. But no one ever mentioned the smell. It was your task that morning to apply it. She was a noblewoman of some consequence, though her name never stuck in your mind, one of those women whose voice was always measured, whose eyes did not wander, who held her arms as if her elbows were carved from gold. She called you in not for ceremony, but for necessity. She was to walk in the garden during the midday hour, and she wished to remain untouched by Ra's gaze. You were given a jar. You were told not to speak of it. You opened the lid. The scent was immediate and unforgettable. Not pungent, not exactly, but full. Animal and sweet, earthy and bitter, like a garden gone to rot. You mixed it with oil as instructed. You asked her to stand. She did. You began with her arms long, pale, marked with faint scars that looked like scratchings on parchment. The dung paste was thick. It clung. It resisted. You spread it in long strokes, careful not to press too hard. Her face remained still, but her breath shortened. You moved to her legs, her back, her collarbone, finally, her cheeks. She did not flinch. She said, "Make sure it is even." And you did. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. She stepped out into the sun like a statue waking. She did not cover her head. She walked the garden path alone. You remained in the shadow of the corridor, waiting, watching. For the first 10 minutes, there was nothing. Then the sweat began to rise. The paste did not hold. It melted slowly, darkening, slipping down her shoulders like spoiled milk. She touched her arm, looked at her fingers. You saw the shift in her mouth, a tightening, a realization. She did not turn back. She finished her walk. When she returned, the skin at her neckline had already reddened. By evening, the blisters had formed. You were not punished. You had followed the instructions. You had measured the proportions precisely. You had stirred clockwise, never counterclockwise. You had applied it with a brush, not your hands. You had done everything they told you. But still, she blistered. And still, the priests insisted it was not the dung. They said the gods had been displeased. You know the truth. The paste did not work. It never worked, but it had been spoken of for too long, believed in too fiercely. And when belief becomes beauty, and beauty becomes safety, No one dares to admit that the remedy is rot. That night, you burned your brush. You rinsed your fingers in vinegar, and you began mixing simpler things, oils that cooled, balms that soothed, pastes that did not promise miracles, only relief. Because you had learned something that day. Even under the sun, even beneath the eye of gods, the body knows what is truth. And no amount of dung, no matter how sacred, can fool skin for long. They vanished quietly, not all at once, not with shouts or torches or the clattering of broken jars on tiled floors, but in the way wind disappears from a corridor you had always thought was sheltered, subtle, slow, and only truly felt once it is gone. First it was a set, the girl who knew how to draw perfect lines with a bit of charcoal and honey paste, who always hummed under her breath while sweeping the floors, who said she would never leave until her fingers stopped obeying. Then Didi, with her crooked smile and jars of balm that she claimed could smooth any scar. Then Pamiu, who smelled always of myrrh and wore her scarf too high because her neck bore something no one dared name. They vanished without screams. No blood on the lintels, no footprints in the dust. One day their beds were slept in, their tools arranged on the edge of the workbench, their cups still half full. And the next morning, their presence was just a memory that no one felt brave enough to name aloud. You asked once, just once, a question that hovered somewhere between genuine confusion and fear. The reply came without hesitation, transferred to the lower kitchens. But you had been to those kitchens, and they did not hum with voices familiar to you. You knew that the bread was shaped differently now, the water drawn slower, the jars rearranged as if by unfamiliar hands. So you stopped asking, but you did not stop noticing. Their rouge jars remained, at first. Their scents lingered. Their brushes hardened where they had been left uncleaned. And then, slowly, those things disappeared too. The jars were swept away, the oils poured out, the brushes burned, all signs replaced by silence. It was not death. Death is noisy in the court. Death demands linen, wailing, formal declarations written in ink that never dries fast enough. This was different. This was absence without grief, erasure by consent. You began watching your own things more closely. You labeled your jars with tiny marks beneath the lids. You wrapped your brushes in double linen. You started sleeping with your pouch of pigments beneath your head, a habit that made your dreams more vivid and your mornings more uncertain. Each day, you waited for your name not to be called, and each day, it still was. But the space around your name felt thinner. One evening, while cleaning the Kohl bowl used by one of the elder priestesses, you found a note, folded tightly, hidden beneath the brush tray. It was not addressed to anyone, not signed. The handwriting was uneven. It read only, "The ones who asked questions first." You burned the note, not because you were afraid of being caught with it, but because you knew you would read it again and again, and each time it would sound louder. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You tried not to draw attention. You stopped laughing when you mixed lip pigment. You softened your voice until even your own ears barely caught it. You let the mistakes of others go uncorrected. You painted more slowly, more gently, as if trying not to wake something. But even that became dangerous. A girl who seems too careful is noticed. A girl who makes no sound is listened to harder. So you chose a new tactic. You told a joke, a harmless one, the kind everyone forgets. You wore your bright scarf again. You asked where the honey jar had gone, even though you had hidden it yourself. You reminded them that you were still here, still soft, still safe. They seemed to believe it. But one night, when you were walking back through the corridor that leads from the chamber of mirrors to the outer courtyard, you saw it on the wall, beneath a curtain left unpinned, a single brushstroke, crimson, thick, uneven. It wasn't paint. It was the last rouge of someone who had not been permitted to finish their face. You stood before it for a long time. Then you dipped your finger in oil and wiped it away, and walked on. It was not love, not in the way the temple scribes defined it, not in the honeyed verses they carved into stone walls for nobles who married out of alliance, not in the songs the younger girls sang while brushing each other's hair in the early dawn, when even the priests had not yet stirred. It was something else, quicker, quieter, warmer in some places, and colder in others. It was a gesture passed between shadows, a risk wrapped in breath, a moment given when no one else was watching, and no one else ever could. You had not planned to kiss her. You had not even planned to be in that hallway, at that hour, carrying that particular vial of amber-based salve for the noblewoman whose rash had returned under her arms, and who blamed your oils for her own lack of washing. You turned the corner, barefoot to avoid waking the guards, and there she was, leaning against the stone, mouth slightly parted, hands tucked behind her back as though she had been waiting there for longer than she had expected. You looked at each other for one full breath, no more. And then you kissed. Not for long, not deeply, not the way the stories tell it, just long enough for something to shift. Her skin was warm, and afterward, she laughed so softly it barely reached your ears. And she said, "I taste rose water." You whispered, "It's the balm I used this morning." And she walked away, one shoulder brushing the wall, and you stood there with the vial in your hand and a heartbeat in your throat that would not slow down for the rest of the night. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You thought nothing of it the next morning. Well, no, not nothing. You thought of the warmth, the breath, the way the air smelled afterward, like sweat and fear and sweetness. But you did not think of what came next. Not until she came to your chamber 3 days later, pale and flushed, holding her sleeve against her cheek. She said nothing. She pulled back the cloth, and there it was, a rash, angry, blooming, cracked in the middle, shaped like a kiss. You said, "What did you eat?" She said, "Nothing new." You asked, "What did you wear?" She said, "What you gave me." And you knew it was the balm. You had made it yourself, mixed from crushed rose petals and almond oil, and a tiny trace of ground beetle bark, which the physicians claimed could reduce inflammation when diluted properly. You had tested it on your arm, on your lips, even on your inner thigh where the skin was softest. It had left no mark, no reaction. But she had always been sensitive. She once broke out in blisters from someone else's perfume worn in the same room. You had forgotten, or ignored it, or thought, foolishly, that your blend would be different. She sat on your floor, and she looked at you, and she asked, "What do I do?" And you said, "Stay here." You made a new paste, fig and clay, soaked in honey, pressed through linen until smooth. You cooled it with aloe and mint. You applied it gently, every fingertip a prayer. She did not speak again until you were done. And when she rose, she said, "Next time, just don't use roses." But there was no next time, not because of the balm, but because the rash never fully faded. And people began to ask. Historians speak of poison, of lips that held secrets, of women who kissed and never returned. But they do not speak of mistakes. They do not speak of tenderness that forgets its recipe. They do not speak of love that leaves a mark, not because it was cruel, but because the world was not built for softness. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. A week later, a servant from the outer house came to your door and handed you a cloth, folded, stiff with something inside. You opened it. It was the same balm you had made, scraped, hardened, wrapped in silence. You burned it that night, You did not sleep. And in the morning, you began making everything from scratch again, new oils, new powders, new rules. You swore to never repeat that mistake. Not because you feared punishment, but because you had learned that a kiss could be a blessing and a warning in the same breath. And your lips, however skilled, were not exempt. You have not kissed anyone since, but sometimes, when you work too late and your hand aches and the lamp flickers low, you still think of the way her voice softened around the word rosewater, and you wonder what would have happened if you had tasted like anything else. They said the tomb had been sealed for over 30 years, untouched by priests or family, guarded not by soldiers, but by time, by distance, and by the kind of silence that gathers around things everyone agrees should be left alone. It sat beyond the second bend of the river, on the dry side, the side the farmers called the listening shore because nothing grew there, and everything you said seemed to echo back, softer than when you spoke it. There was no ceremony planned for its opening, no public reading of her name, no singers, just dust, stone, and the quiet footsteps of the two who had been chosen to enter. You were not one of them, but you were the one they called when the jar was found. It had not been in a chest, not wrapped in linen. It had been resting atop her ribs, nestled between the bones, like something that had grown there. The jar itself was not marked, but the pigment inside Rouge, still bright, still pliant, still fragrant, was unmistakable. It had been yours. You knew the scent. You knew the way it clung to glass. You knew the slight flaw in the color, that subtle shade between coral and rust that only came from using crushed tamarisk bark rather than the more expensive carmine root. You had mixed it for her with your own hands, and now she was wearing it in death. The lips were still red, still perfectly shaped, still curved in that faint smile she had always worn when she wanted to be remembered as kind. Not powerful, and she had been powerful, not by birth, not by marriage, but by choice, by charm, by wit, by timing. She had arrived in the palace as a cousin's cousin, barely noticed, and by the time she died, entire halls were repainted in her favorite colors, and 3 governors owed her favors no one dared collect. She had asked you for rouge that would last, not for the festival, not for the feast, but for after, and you had made it. You had asked no questions. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You had wondered, of course, back then, before her death, before the fever took her, before she faded like a torch left burning too long in the wind. You had noticed her obsession with appearances sharpen into something else, something harder. She asked to be painted even on days when she did not leave her room. She wore scent to bed. She dyed her nails with crushed beetroot and sealed them with resin that turned black when the moonlight touched it. She practiced her smile in the mirror long after the servants had left. And one night, she took your hands in hers, your stained hands, your hands still warm from the oils, and she said, "I want them to see me, even when I'm gone." You thought she meant memory. You had no idea she meant the tomb. When you arrived at the excavation site, the others stepped back. No one else wanted to touch the face. Not because they feared her, though perhaps they did, but because it looked too perfect, too human, too recent. The rest of her had decayed. The linen was stiff, the bones exposed in places, the hair long turned to ash, but her lips remained, glossed, red, full, undisturbed. You touched them with the brush. They flaked slightly. You recoiled not from disgust, but from awe. You had never seen your work endure like this. You had never wanted it to. You returned that night with a new jar, the same recipe. You placed it on the edge of your table, and you stared at it for hours. You did not sleep. You did not speak of her to anyone else. But in the morning, when you opened your pouch to paint the wife of the grain inspector, you chose the same shade. And as you painted her, your hands remembered her, the shape of her mouth, the rhythm of her breath, the way she had always tilted her chin when you worked, not to help you, but to help her be remembered. Historians will speak of mummies, of preservation, of embalming and sacred oils. They will describe the rituals of death with reverence and precision. But they will not write about Rouge. They will not write about the vanity of ghosts. They will not write about the way a dead woman's lips can mock time. And yet you saw it. You touched it. You remembered it. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You kept the second jar for years. Not because you thought you would need it again, but because part of you feared you already had. You swore you saw her once. Not her ghost, not a dream. A girl in the market with her smile, with her lips, with that exact shade. You turned, she was gone. And now, sometimes, when the evening light strikes a mirror just right, when your own reflection catches you off guard, you wonder if she is still wearing it beneath the ground, behind the stone, inside the hush of that sealed chamber. You wonder if she knew what it would mean, to be buried with her beauty still on, to be remembered not for what she did, but for how she appeared. And you wonder whether it was a victory or a warning. The argument did not begin with shouting. It did not even begin with words. It began, as most real arguments do, with silence that was too long, too heavy, too carefully placed between two people who both knew the other was thinking the same thing but would not admit it aloud. You were sitting cross-legged on the edge of the workroom floor, surrounded by jars, trays, dried flower petals, and the sticky remains of a balm you had attempted to refine for the 4th time this month. Across from you was Nebu, the scribe's daughter turned court apprentice, who had been assigned to observe your technique for what the high overseer called documentary accuracy. She was clever. She was careful. She wrote beautifully, but she had not yet learned the danger of asking certain questions out loud. "You do know it's poison," she said finally, her voice soft, almost affectionate, as if she were offering you a second piece of bread rather than a heresy. You did not answer, so she repeated it. The lead in the Kohl, the mercury in the lightning salves, the crushed stones in the shimmer powders. You know they're poison. And you said nothing, because she was not wrong, but she was not right either. Instead, you stood. You took the brush from the tray beside you. You dipped it in the dark Kohl, the one that sat in a separate bowl, the one reserved for the most powerful women, the ones who stared too long at others, or not long enough. And you held it toward her. "Close your eyes," you said. She hesitated, but she did, and you painted the line, one stroke, then another, then a small flick at the edge. When you finished, she opened her eyes and looked at you. So she asked, and you said, "Now you look like someone who can't be questioned." And she said, "But it's still poison." And you said, "No, it's belief. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way." The room was quiet after that. You crushed petals in silence. She wrote nothing, and yet the dust between you began to speak louder than anything she could record. Because the truth, the one you would not write, not in ink, not even in your own mind, was that yes, you had known, for years, not from a scroll, not from the warnings of healers, from the bodies, from the skin that blistered too easily, from the hair that fell out in clumps, from the hands of noblewomen that trembled after too many years of constant paint, from the queen's cousin who used the white salve daily and lost her voice before 30, from the child dancer who licked her lips too often and died before harvest. But you had also seen something else. You had seen the way the red made them bolder, the way the shimmer made them stand taller, The way the kohl around the eyes turned whispers into commands. You had seen women walk into a room and silence it with nothing but color. You had seen bruises disappear under rouge, and no one dared ask why. You had seen fear retreat when painted beauty arrived. And so you had kept painting, because beauty was power, and poison was part of power. Not its opposite, its ingredient. Nebu returned the next day. She brought no papyrus, no ink, just a jar. She said, "I want to learn the old blend." You asked, "The one with lead?" She said, "The one that made the priestess cry when she saw herself." You nodded, and you taught her, because the debate was over. Not won, just quieted. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. Years later, she would send you a letter. Not long, not formal, just one sentence. "I understand now why you never called it a lie." And beneath her name, she had left a smear of red, the exact shade you had taught her. You burned the letter, not in anger, in agreement, because some truths must disappear in smoke, not to hide them, but to let them rise. The powders you use now are safer. You found ways to substitute, crushed roots instead of metals, clays filtered through linen and prayer. You teach the new girls how to paint with care, but sometimes, late at night, when your hands remember the way the old brush moved, when your fingers itch for the weight of the forbidden jar, you wonder, did they know it was poison, or did they believe it was magic? And if they believed it hard enough, did it matter? Because the lines you painted still linger, even if the hands that wore them are now dust. It is not the first time you sit here. It is not the 10th. It is not even the 100th. This mirror, this cold, dented disc of bronze that has reflected more longing than vanity, has been with you longer than any servant, longer than any friend, longer than even your own memory can reliably reach. You do not remember where you first received it. You only remember that it has always been there, lying flat upon the table's edge, tilted slightly toward the eastern light, catching just enough of the morning sun to remind you that there is still a face to be painted, even when the body behind it feels too heavy to rise. Tonight, however, is different, because tonight the room is too quiet. The lamps have burned down low, their oil congealing at the edges. The jars are sealed, the brushes are clean. No apprentices bustle through the doorway asking for permission to grind pigment or borrow your second-best coal tray. The door has not creaked in hours. The coals in the brazier are no longer red, only dull gray lumps nestled against one another like memories that refuse to be reignited. You are alone, not for the first time, but for what feels like the final. You reach for the mirror. It is heavier than usual. Or perhaps your hands are weaker. You hold it carefully, angling it beneath the flicker of the dying lamp. And what you see startles you not because it is unfamiliar, but because it is too familiar. There are your eyes, rimmed with the faintest echo of yesterday's kohl, despite your careful cleansing. There are your lips, still bearing the faint stain of a rose pigment you mixed 2 weeks ago for a noblewoman who never showed. There are the creases around your mouth, deeper now, carved not by laughter, but by long nights bent over jars. And there, most of all, is the tremble in your hand. You place the mirror down gently, because if you don't, you'll drop it. And if it breaks, you are not certain what it would reflect anymore. Some stories speak louder in whispers. If you're half asleep, let it stay that way. You reach for the rouge, the old one, the one whose lid you haven't opened in years. Not because it is no longer good, it is, though it has thickened slightly, but because it carries too many names. Every time you hold it, you hear a voice, hers, theirs, yours. Every time you press your finger to it, you remember what it meant to paint a mouth that had something to say and wasn't allowed to say it aloud. Every time you lift a brush, You remember someone who never came back. But tonight, the mirror is waiting. And so you open the jar. You apply it slowly. You do not rush. You draw the color across your lips as if each stroke is an answer to a question no one dared ask. Then the Kohl. Just one line. Then a second. You smudge the edge. You do not try to look younger. You try only to look honest. And the mirror agrees. You sit back. The room has not changed. But you remember every face you ever painted. The proud, the frightened, the hopeful, the dead. You remember the girl who wanted rouge for her burial. The woman who wanted Kohl before war. The priestess who wore shimmer that made the gods seem more real than myths. The queen who never aged, at least not in public. The child who asked to look brave. The old woman who asked only not to look forgotten. You remember your own face the day you first touched pigment. You remember thinking it was a kind of magic. It still is. Historians will never understand this. They will record the tools. They will quote the recipes. They will chart the rise of fashion and the trade routes that brought foreign colors into sacred chambers. But they will not understand what the mirror knows. That painting is not transformation. It is declaration. It is resistance. It is remembrance. And that every brushstroke is a kind of prayer not to gods, not to rulers, but to the person beneath the skin. If your eyelids are growing heavy, you don't need to follow every word. You lean forward. Your breath fogs the glass. You wipe it gently. You smile, not because you feel joy, but because the mirror deserves truth. You speak aloud, not loudly, just enough. You say, "I am still here." The room does not answer, but it doesn't need to. You reach for the final jar. You unscrew it. You dip your brush, and you begin again. Because painting your face is not about being seen. It is about seeing, and the mirror remembers. It always does.